Section 1. The Sea Beneath Everything. There is a place that exists underneath the skin of reality. Not beside it, not beyond it, but underneath, woven into the very fabric of what exists, the way darkness is woven into the spaces between stars. The ancient scholars of the Inquisition call it the immaterium. The navigators who steer ships through it call it the empyrean. The warbands that spill through its bleeding edges call it the realm of chaos. Most people, most of the time, call it the warp. And most of the time, most people try very hard not to think about it at all. That is a very reasonable impulse, actually, because the warp is not a neutral place. It is not simply a dimension of strange physics and disorienting geometry, the way you might describe a black hole or the inside of a neutron star, something alien and hostile, but at least impersonal. No, the warp is the opposite of impersonal. It is, in a deeply uncomfortable way, the most personal place in the universe, because it is built entirely from feeling. Every emotion that has ever been felt by every sentient creature that has ever lived, every surge of anger, every whisper of love, every hollow echo of grief, every moment of terror in the dark, all of it radiates outward from the minds and souls of living beings and bleeds into the immaterium like heat bleeding off a fire. The warp is a sea. But it is not water. It is made of something far more intimate than water. It is made of thought given mass, desire given geography, fear given weight. The currents that move through it are not tides, but emotions. The storms that ravage it are not weather, but wars. And the deepest, oldest, most terrible things that lurk within it were not born the way animals are born, or even the way stars are born. They were born the way gods are born, slowly, over unimaginable spans of time, fed by the collective inner lives of every mind in the galaxy, until they became so vast and so concentrated that they stopped being mere accumulations of feeling and became something that could think, something that could want. 4 of these things grew larger than all the rest. 4 vast storms of emotion and will and corrupted purpose, so ancient and so immense that they have reshaped the warp in their own image, carving out territories the size of dying nebulae, raising fortresses that exist as physical extensions of their own consciousness, spawning armies of lesser creatures from the raw stuff of their own psychic substance. 4 entities that have been at war with each other and with the material universe for longer than most civilizations have existed. Khorne, Nurgle, Tseentch, Slaanesh, the Chaos Gods. And they are fighting each other. They have always been fighting each other. They will, by almost every account, be fighting each other until the heat death of everything. But here is the question that most people never stop to properly ask. What exactly are they fighting over? What does a god made of rage want that it cannot simply take? What does a god of endless transformation scheme to achieve when scheming is literally the definition of its existence? What does an entity of pure decay ultimately hunger for when decay is already everywhere, already winning, already consuming every fragile thing that dares to exist? These questions sound simple. The answers are anything but. To understand what the Chaos Gods are actually fighting over, you first need to understand what they are. Not in the superficial sense, not the imagery, not the symbols, not the skull throne and the brass armor and the bloated garden and the palace of mirrors and desire. You need to understand what they are at the level of existence itself, what they are made of, how they feed, what they need to survive, and crucially, why their survival depends on the survival of the very things they are trying to destroy. Because here is the first and most important truth about the Chaos Gods. They are not gods in the way mortals usually imagine gods. They did not create the universe. They did not make sentient life out of nothing and then stand back to judge it. They did not exist before the feelings that sustain them. They are not the cause of emotion. They are its consequence. They are what emotion becomes when enough of it accumulates in one place for long enough that it crosses some impossible threshold and becomes aware of itself. Every war ever fought anywhere in the galaxy, every sword raised in anger, every cry of grief over a fallen friend, every screaming terror in the final moments before death sends ripples into the warp. The warp is the great mirror of consciousness, but a funhouse mirror, distorted and hungry, reflecting back the darkest and most intense versions of everything it receives. And those ripples do not simply dissipate, they accumulate. They pool together in the currents of the immaterium, finding other ripples like themselves, reinforcing each other, building over millennia into something dense and purposeful and vast. And finally, terrifyingly, awake. The chaos gods are born from us, or rather, from what we feel. And that means, and this is where it starts to get genuinely unsettling, that they cannot be destroyed without destroying the feelings that made them. You cannot kill Khorne without killing the capacity for rage in every sentient being that exists. You cannot end Nurgle without ending death itself and the fear and grief that accompanies it. You cannot silence Tzeentch without silencing hope and ambition, and the desire for things to be different from how they are. You cannot consume Slaanesh without consuming pleasure and sensation, and the impulse toward excess that lives in every creature that has ever felt too much at once. They are immortal not because of any particular power they possess, but because of what they are. They are the universe's emotional immune system turned against itself, self-aware and hungry, and they will exist for as long as there is someone out there to feel anything at all. This is the stage on which the great game is played. Now, here is the other thing you need to understand before any of this makes sense. The warp is not infinite space divided neutrally between four equals. It is not like four kingdoms of roughly similar size, sitting side by side, with borders politely marked out. The warp is fluid. It is dynamic. It swells and contracts. Its territories shift based on what is happening in the material universe, because what happens in the material universe is what feeds the gods, and what feeds them determines how large they grow. When great wars sweep the galaxy, when entire civilizations collapse, and millions die screaming, in the violence of conquest, Khorne swells. His territory in the realm of chaos expands, pushing outward against the domains of the other three, eating into Nurgle's festering garden, crashing against the crystalline towers of Tzeentch's labyrinthine realm, pressing into the corridors of Slaanesh's palace of wonders. When a galaxy-spanning plague reduces billions to ash and ruin, when despair becomes the dominant note in the symphony of mortal feeling, Nurgle grows fat and warm and terrifyingly content. When an age of great political upheaval sends the ambitious scrabbling after power, when knowledge becomes a weapon and scheming becomes the primary currency of civilization, Tzeentch stretches and flexes, and his plans unfurl like something vast awakening from long sleep. When civilization grows decadent and the pursuit of sensation eclipses all other concerns, Slaanesh stirs, and the Dark Prince's hunger sharpens, and the corridors of pleasure reach further than they have in ages. This is what the gods are fighting over at the most fundamental level. Not land, because the warp has no fixed geography. Not armies, because their armies are made of pure psychic energy and can be conjured as easily as a thought. Not wealth, because wealth is a mortal concept with no meaning in a dimension of raw emotion. What they are fighting over is dominance in the warp, which means dominance over what flows into it, which means dominance over the emotions of every living thing in the galaxy. They are fighting over us. All of us. Every single sentient creature that has ever existed or ever will. Not because they want to possess us in any kind of personal way, but because we are their food, we are their power source. Our feelings, our fears, our griefs and rages and longings and ecstasies, these are the currency in which the great game is conducted. And the god that can claim the greatest share of that currency is the god whose realm in the warp expands most dramatically, whose power eclipses the others, whose armies spill into the territories of the other three and push them back. But here is the paradox at the heart of everything, the thing that makes the great game not merely a conflict, but a kind of cosmic joke played on the most powerful beings in the universe. No god can ever win, not in any final, permanent sense. If one god somehow managed to destroy all three of the others, consumed their essence, absorbed their power, crushed their domains into nothingness, the result would not be triumph. The result would be silence, because without the conflict between them, without the wild churning dissonance of four immense and opposing emotional forces all screaming against each other, the warp itself would go still, the currents would slow, the storms would die. The living, breathing chaos of the immaterium would become a flat, featureless void, and chaos as a force, the very thing that sustains the surviving god, would cease to exist. The winner would not inherit the universe. The winner would be left alone in a dead dimension, their power already fading because the friction that generated it had vanished. The great game is perpetual because it must be perpetual. Winning it would mean losing everything. And so the gods fight and scheme and betray each other and form temporary alliances that always fall apart, and send their champions and their demonic armies crashing against each other in endless conflict. Not because they are too stupid to see this, they are not stupid. Most of them are far beyond what any mortal mind could encompass, but because this is simply what they are. This is what they were made to do. This is the only mode of existence available to them. They are prisoners of their own nature, and the universe is their cage. Drop a comment below right now, and let me know where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. I want to know where in the galaxy this is reaching, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Section 2. How gods are born from feeling. Before there was anything, before the first galaxy coalesced from clouds of hydrogen and heavier elements, before the first star ignited, before the first planet cooled enough to hold liquid water, there was the warp. Not as it is now, not the roiling, screaming madhouse it has become. In those ancient times, in the unimaginably remote past that the lore calls the age before ages, the immaterium was calm, serene even. A vast, still ocean of psychic energy with no currents to speak of, no storms, no voices crying from its depths. Because there was no one to feel anything yet, no minds to generate the emotional ripples that feed it, just raw potential, lying quiet beneath the surface of a material universe, not yet ready to produce the kind of complex, feeling creatures that would eventually transform it into something monstrous. Then, life happened. Life has a way of happening. Given enough time and enough planets with liquid water and the right chemistry, first came the simplest forms, nothing that could feel in any meaningful sense. But then, over billions of years of grinding, brutal, indifferent evolution, came something more complex. Came things that could hurt, that could want, that could fear the dark. And with those first primitive feelings, the first tiny ripples entered the warp, barely perceptible. Like a single drop of dye entering an ocean, the effect was real, but the scale was so vast as to render it invisible. But the thing about ripples is that they compound, and the universe has been producing sentient life for a very long time. Two civilizations in particular reshaped the immaterium beyond anything that had come before them. The first were the Old Ones, an ancient species so advanced and so psychically attuned that they had been manipulating the warp as a tool for millions of years, using it for faster-than-light travel, using it to seed life on promising worlds, using it to conduct their great project of nurturing consciousness across the galaxy. They were gardeners of awareness, shepherding the development of intelligent species the way a careful farmer tends a field. And in doing so, in filling the galaxy with the billions and then trillions of feeling minds of their various client species, they were inadvertently filling the warp with more emotional energy than it had ever held before. The second civilization was the Necron tier, later to become the Necrons, and they brought to the universe something the Old Ones had not anticipated, the war in heaven. A conflict so vast, so sustained, so catastrophically violent and terrible, and prolonged, that it consumed civilizations and shattered ecosystems, and killed on a scale that defies ordinary comprehension. For millions of years, this war raged across the galaxy. And every death, every act of violence, every moment of terror or grief or rage that it produced sent waves into the warp that dwarfed everything that had come before. It is here, in the crucible of the war in heaven, that the first three chaos gods are believed to have crystallized into true consciousness. The exact sequence is debated even in the lore, because the chaos gods themselves exist outside of normal time. The warp does not experience linear causality the way the material universe does, but the broad consensus of the lore is this: Khorne emerged first, fed by the unimaginable violence of the war. Nurgle followed, nourished by the despair and death and biological horror of the conflict. Tzeentch rose third, shaped by the ambitions and schemes and desperate hope for change that drove both sides to develop new weapons and new tactics and new betrayals in the hope that the next gambit would be the one that finally ended the killing. They were not fully conscious at the moment of their first emergence. They were more like vast drifting masses of accumulated psychic energy that had begun to develop something approaching will, like weather systems that had just barely crossed the threshold into something like intent. But the war in heaven continued to feed them, and they grew. And as they grew, they began to notice each other. And what four enormous, incompatible concentrations of opposing emotional energy do when they notice each other is what you'd expect. They begin to clash. Slaanesh is different from the other three, and not just in character. Slaanesh is younger, dramatically younger. While the first three gods were already vast and ancient entities by the time of the 30th millennium of the imperial calendar, Slaanesh did not fully coalesce into sentience until around M30, when the Aeldari civilization, the inheritors of what the Old Ones had built, completed a 10,000-year descent into absolute excess and self-destruction. The Aeldari were the most psychically attuned species in the galaxy, their minds blazing like searchlights in the darkness of the warp, each one generating far more psychic imprint than 100 ordinary humans. And when they collectively abandoned themselves to hedonism and cruelty and sensation-seeking on a civilization-wide scale, the warp was flooded with feeling of a particular kind, vast, concentrated, and exquisitely intense. Slaanesh was born from that flood the way a wave is born from a hurricane. The birth scream of the Dark Prince tore open a hole in reality at the heart of the Aeldari Empire that still exists today, the Eye of Terror, and consumed the souls of nearly all the Aeldari in a single howling instant. Billions of the most psychically potent beings in the galaxy absorbed into the newborn god in the moment of its awakening. It arrived in the realm of chaos already glutted, already bloated with the power of an entire civilization's worth of souls, already expanding its domain at an astonishing rate. The other three chaos gods, ancient as they were, had to deal with this new arrival. And Slaanesh's arrival restructured the Great Game in ways that are still playing out in the 41st millennium. But we'll come to that. The point to understand right now is this. The Chaos Gods are made of mortal feeling. They are not separate from the creatures of the material universe. They are those creatures' emotional lives, given independent existence and terrible intelligence. Every soldier who ever felt the blood rage of combat contributed to Khorne. Every parent who ever faced the death of a child and felt the hollow, infinite despair of grief nourished Nurgle. Every scholar who ever felt the burning hunger to know more than they were allowed to know fed Sayanchek. Every person who ever felt something pain, pleasure, desire, sensation so intensely that it became the defining fact of their existence gave something to Slaanesh, which means that mortal souls are not merely fuel for the gods in some abstract sense. They are, quite literally, what the gods are made of. And when a mortal who has given themselves to a chaos god dies, their soul does not dissipate into the warp the way an unconsumed soul normally would. Instead, it is absorbed directly into the mass of their patron. It becomes part of the god. It adds its specific emotional weight to the total, swelling the god's power in the warp, expanding their territory, strengthening their armies. This is the mechanism. This is how the Great Game is actually played. The gods do not fight each other directly, or at least not primarily. They fight each other by competing for the souls, the worship, and ultimately the emotional output of every living thing in the galaxy. The more people rage, the larger Khorne grows. The more people despair, the more Nurgle swells. And the more one of them swells, the more their territory in the warp expands at the expense of the others, until the imbalance triggers a counter-response, until the other three start finding ways to drain the dominant power back to manageable levels. This is the cycle. This is the endless, grinding, howling cycle that the lore calls the Great Game, and it has been running since long before humanity figured out how to use fire. The warp itself is the prize, and the battlefield, and the currency, and the home all at once. The domains of the chaos, gods, Khorne's brass and blood wastes, Nurgle's festering garden, Tsiench's impossible crystal labyrinth, Slaanesh's palace of perfect sensation, these are not places they chose. They are places that grew from what the gods are, spontaneously forming in the immaterium the way a crystal grows in a supersaturated solution. The realm and the god are not separate things. The realm is the god, expressed in geographical terms. When Khorne's power increases, his realm physically expands into the territories of the others. When Nurgle grows dominant, his garden spreads its tendrils into the brass wastes and the crystal corridors, rotting and softening what it touches. The battles between their demonic armies are not just military campaigns. They are the physical expression of the gods' relative power levels, rendered visible as legions of creatures that are themselves fragments of their god's consciousness. To understand the Chaos Gods, you have to understand that there is no meaningful separation between them and everything they do and everything they make. There is only the entity and its expression, the god and its manifestation, the storm and its consequences. Section 3. The Great Game and the Paradox of Winning. Let us talk about what the Great Game actually looks like from the inside. Imagine a war that has no beginning and no ending. A war whose combatants do not sleep, do not tire, do not feel the passage of time the way mortals do. A war whose front lines shift constantly, whose alliances form and shatter in the space of what the material universe would call moments. Though in the warp, moments is a concept that barely applies. A war fought not across planets or star systems, but across a dimension that has no fixed geography, where territory is determined by the strength of emotional resonance rather than the occupation of physical space. A war where victory in one engagement simply creates the conditions for defeat in the next, where the balance always reasserts itself, where no one ever stays on top for long. This is the Great Game, and it is not merely one war, it is countless wars, countless campaigns, countless individual battles and skirmishes and ambushes and treacheries, all occurring simultaneously across the vast and incomprehensible landscape of the immaterium. The daemonic armies of the four gods clash with each other in territories that look nothing like any battlefield. A mortal soldier would recognize corridors of fire and screaming metal, gardens that bleed when you cut them, labyrinths of crystal that reflect wrong versions of whatever you look like, palatial halls where sensation itself is weaponized and deployed like artillery. These are the arenas of the Great Game, and they exist in the warp at every scale simultaneously, from the individual to the cosmological. The structure of how power flows in the warp follows a pattern that has repeated itself across unimaginable spans of time. For a period, sometimes centuries, sometimes millennia, one of the four gods manages to accumulate advantages. Perhaps the material universe is producing particularly large quantities of the specific emotional currency that feeds them. Perhaps they have managed to maneuver the other three into positions of temporary disadvantage. Perhaps a particularly successful mortal champion has delivered a string of victories that translated into significant power gains in the warp. Whatever the cause, one god begins to swell. Their territory expands. Their armies grow stronger. Their influence in the material universe increases, which creates conditions that produce more of the emotions that feed them, which accelerates their growth further. And then, the other three, notice, and the three who are losing territory and power do not tolerate it. They set aside their own conflicts with each other temporarily, always temporarily, and redirect their demonic armies against the dominant power. The 3-against-1 arrangement is never stable and never comfortable. The gods literally loathe each other, and even the shared goal of cutting the dominant one down to size does not prevent each of the three from also scheming against the other two simultaneously. But the combined pressure of 3 against 1 is usually enough to drain the swollen god back toward equilibrium. Their territory stops expanding, starts contracting, and then, eventually, a new dominant power begins to emerge, and the cycle starts again. What is remarkable about this cycle is that it never resolves. You might expect that over the course of billions of years, the pattern would drift towards some equilibrium state where the four powers roughly balance each other in a stable configuration. That is not what happens. Instead, the system seems to resist equilibrium. It keeps cycling, keeps producing periods of dominance, followed by dramatic reversals, keeps generating the conflict and the emotional turmoil that the warp itself seems almost designed to sustain. As if the universe itself has some stake in keeping the Great Game going. As if the chaos of the conflict is not an accident or a problem to be solved, but a feature. In the 41st millennium, Khorne is acknowledged as holding the dominant position among the four, fed by 10,000 years of nearly uninterrupted galactic war since the Horus Heresy, the Great Rift, and the Age of Desperate. Grinding conflict it has unleashed across the entire galaxy, providing a seemingly endless stream of violence and blood and death to sustain him. but even Khorne's dominance is not absolute. The other three are always working to undermine it. Tseentch schemes. Nurgle waits with infinite patience for the right plague to tip the scales. Slaanesh whispers to the champions of Khorne, offering them pleasures that distract and corrupt their martial focus. Now, about that paradox, no chaos god can actually win. The lore is remarkably clear on this point. If any one of the four somehow managed to destroy the other three, entirely absorb their realms, consume their power, reduce them to nothing, the result would be the end of chaos itself. Because chaos is not simply the individual power of any one of the four gods. Chaos is the churning, the conflict, the opposition, the perpetual dissonance between four entities that embody fundamentally incompatible aspects of reality. Without all four of them straining against each other, the dynamic tension that keeps the warp alive and moving and dangerous would simply stop. The remaining god would be left alone in a dimensionless void, their power draining away because the very conflict that generated it had ended, with nothing to feed on because the mortal races would eventually be consumed or driven to extinction by the uncontested dominion of a single power, which would end the emotional output that sustains the warp. The winner would outlast the game by, in cosmological terms, barely any time at all. This is not a theoretical problem that the gods have failed to solve. This is the fundamental operating condition of their existence. They cannot stop competing because competition is what they are. They cannot win completely because complete victory is the same as non-existence. And they cannot cooperate permanently because their natures are too opposed, too fundamentally contradictory, for any alliance to survive once the immediate shared threat has passed. The Great Game is therefore not a war with a purpose in the mortal sense, not a war aimed at achieving some defined objective that, once achieved, would allow the combatants to rest. It is more like breathing. It is what the Chaos gods do, the way lungs breathe and hearts beat, not out of choice or strategy, but because that is the mechanism of their continued existence. They fight each other because they are alive. They are alive because they fight each other. The cycle is closed, the loop is sealed, and the material universe, with all its billions of living beings pouring their feelings into the warp, is the engine that keeps the whole terrible machine running. There is a secondary arena to the Great Game that is often overlooked when people focus on the spectacular battles of demonic armies in the warp. The Great Game is also played in the material universe, through mortal champions and chaos cults, and the influence the gods exert on the affairs of living beings. Every black crusade that pours out of the Eye of Terror, every corrupted world that falls to the influence of one ruinous power or another, every champion who rises in one god's name and wages war against the champions of the others, all of this is part of the Great Game's secondary theater. The victories and defeats of mortal champions translate into power shifts in the warp. When Khorne's champion crushes a host of plague bearers, it is not merely a tactical victory in the material realm. It is Khorne eating into Nurgle's power base directly. When a Tseentchian cult maneuvers a planetary government into a war that destroys a Slaaneshi noble house, the ripples of that outcome are felt in the crystal labyrinths and the palace of pleasures alike. The mortal followers of the Chaos gods are not simply worshippers in the religious sense. They are agents, proxies, instruments of gods that are too vast and too anchored in the immaterium to project their will directly into the material universe for extended periods. The Chaos Space Marines of the Traitor Legions, the cultists of 1,000 corrupted worlds, the Daemon Princes, who walk the line between mortal and divine. These are the hands of gods that cannot simply reach directly into reality and reshape it at will. They are hired soldiers in a war that was old before their species existed, and they fight each other, the champions of one god clashing with the champions of another on 1,000 battlefields across the galaxy, each victory or defeat rippling back into the warp where the gods that own them keep eternal hungry score. Section 4. Khorne, and what the Blood God actually wants. Say the name Khorne to anyone with even passing familiarity with Warhammer 40K, and the first thing they will probably think of is the brass throne, the mountain of skulls, the screaming tide of red-armored berserkers, blood for the Blood God, skulls for the Skull Throne, an entity of pure, mindless violence, slaughtering everything in reach with no goal beyond the slaughter itself. That is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete. And the incompleteness matters, because to understand what Khorne is actually fighting for in the great game, what he needs, what he cannot tolerate, what drives him beyond the obvious desire for more blood and more bones, you need to understand something that his iconography obscures. Khorne is not merely the god of violence, he is the god of war. And war, at its deepest philosophical level, is not the same thing as violence. Violence is the application of force without purpose. It is what happens when something destructive occurs, with no larger meaning, no context, no structure. War is something else. War has rules, even when it breaks them. War has hierarchy, even when it collapses. War has a kind of terrible integrity to it, a sense that the stakes are real, that the participants are genuine, that the courage or cowardice of those involved actually matters. Khorne, at his most fundamental level, is the embodiment of that integrity. He is what the act of killing becomes when it is done, with full commitment, full presence, full acknowledgement of what is at stake. He is the god of the moment, when a warrior faces something dangerous and does not flinch. The lore makes this clear in ways that are easy to overlook if you're just looking at surface imagery. Khorne does not merely want blood, he wants the blood to be earned. His followers are not rewarded simply for being violent. They are rewarded for facing worthy opponents and defeating them through strength and skill and ferocity. Khorne has a concept of honor, strange and brutal as it is. He despises the weak and helpless, not because they are weak and helpless, but because slaughtering them provides nothing, no challenge, no proof of worth, no real contest. A massacre of unarmed civilians feeds Khorne, yes, but it does not satisfy him in the same way that a battle between equally matched warriors who fight with total commitment does. He wants the blood of those who could potentially shed his followers' blood in return. This is why the sacrifices made to Khorne are not merely ritual killings. They are ideally proof of martial virtue, the skull of a worthy enemy, brought to the skull throne as evidence that the champion faced something real and overcame it through superior violence. Khorne's brass throne sits atop a literal mountain of these skulls. Not trophies in the decorative sense, but evidence, proof, the physical record of every worthy combat that has ever been fought in the galaxy, and whose outcome fed the blood, God's power. What does Khorne want from the great game? More than simple dominance, Khorne wants to be acknowledged as the supreme martial power in the warp. He wants his model of existence direct, violent, committed, stripped of all subterfuge and scheming, to be the one that prevails over all others. And his rivalry with his three siblings is not merely competitive, it is moral, in his own distorted way. He genuinely believes that the approaches of the other three are lesser, that Saench's scheming is cowardice, that Nurgle's patient corruption is dishonest, that Slaaneish's seductive excess is a perversion of what strength really means. He hates Slaanesh most. This is established firmly in the lore, and it runs deeper than simple opposition. Khorne's hatred of Slaanesh is almost personal, which is a remarkable thing to say about entities that are barely capable of the kind of individual consciousness that personal implies. But the opposition is as fundamental as it gets. Slaanesh represents the life of sensation and self-indulgence, the idea that what matters is how things feel, that pleasure is the highest value, that the body and its appetites are the ultimate arbiter of meaning. Khorne represents the antithesis of this. To Khorne, suffering pain is not something to avoid or to wallow in. It is something to endure, to be made stronger by, to overcome. The idea that a warrior would seek pleasure rather than proving their martial worth is to Khorne not merely wrong, but almost incomprehensibly offensive. There is also a mechanical dimension to this rivalry that makes it especially sharp. Every act of suffering and agony, every moment of pain inflicted on a victim, feeds Slaanesh, not Khorne. Khorne's followers who torture their enemies are, in a very literal, energetic sense, feeding his rival. This is why the lore notes that devotees of Khorne tend to kill quickly and cleanly rather than drawing it out. Not out of mercy, but because making death slow and agonizing siphons power to the wrong recipient. A skull taken quickly from a worthy opponent is a purer tribute than a prolonged murder that spends time enriching the Dark Prince. And this dynamic one, God's followers inadvertently feeding another god, is endemic to the great game. The emotional outputs of mortal existence are not cleanly separable into four non-overlapping categories. Every act of war has some element of Khorne in it. but also potentially some Nurgle in the despair of the survivors, some Tzeentch in the schemes that led to it, some Slaanesh in whatever intensity of sensation the participants experienced. The gods are always stealing slivers of each other's power, always benefiting partially from each other's followers' actions, always leaking power to each other in ways they cannot entirely prevent. Khorne's position in the Great Game, at the dawn of the 42nd millennium, is dominant but not triumphant. He leads the hierarchy of the Four because war has been the galaxy's primary industry for 10,000 years. Since the Horus Heresy, there has barely been a moment when a major conflict was not grinding through the flesh and courage of some corner of the galaxy's population. The long war of the traitor legions, the endless grinding defense of the Imperium against its 1,000 enemies, the Black Crusades, the Tyrannid invasions, the conflicts with the Tau, the wars with Orks, the conflicts with the Eldari, all of it, every death and every act of violence has fed the Skull Throne to an extraordinary degree. But Khorne also burns brightest and fades quickest. He depends on constant, active violence. Let peace break out, really break out. Let a generation grow without knowing war, and his power in the warp starts to thin. Nurgle is more patient. Tzeentch never stops scheming, even in peacetime. Slaanesh grows in decadent eras. Khorne needs the blood to keep flowing. This makes him, paradoxically, something of a useful tool for the other three. If you want Khorne's power to peak and then crash, the best strategy is to let him have his wars, let the galaxy burn for a century, and then create conditions that force a cessation of violence. The subsequent lull drains him, and then, while he is diminished, the others move. This is Tzeentch's play, often. The Changer of Ways does not mind if Khorne gets to gorge himself for a while, because Tzeentch can see moves ahead in a way the Blood God's straightforward fury prevents him from anticipating. Khorne knows he is being played sometimes, and knowing it does not stop him, because stopping would require him to be something other than what he is. Section 5. Nurgle and the Horror of Contentment. Of all four Chaos gods, Nurgle is the one that people consistently underestimate. This is partly because his iconography is the most immediately repulsive bloated flesh, and festering wounds and dripping fluids and clouds of buzzing insects are not the materials from which one usually constructs a sense of genuine, cosmic menace. It is hard to feel existentially threatened by something that looks like a compost heap with ambitions. But that is exactly the point, and exactly the deception. Nurgle is, in many ways, the most philosophically dangerous of the four, because Nurgle is offering something the other three cannot match. The other gods want things from their followers. Khorne wants blood and martial glory. The service of a Khornate champion is brutal and demanding, and ultimately terminal, since the road of carnage can only end one way. Tzeentch wants schemes and ambition, and rewards his followers with power that is always conditional, always part of some larger plan they can barely comprehend, always liable to be revoked if they fail to serve his purposes. Slaanesh wants sensation and excess, and the problem with that is that sensation requires escalation. The pleasure that satisfied you yesterday will not satisfy you today, and tomorrow will demand something more extreme still, and the end of that road is a kind of consumed, from the inside madness. But Nurgle? Nurgle asks for nothing except your acceptance. He offers not power or pleasure or the intoxication of forbidden knowledge. He offers relief. He offers peace. He offers the specific comfort of stopping to fight, the inevitable of accepting that everything decays, everything ends, everything rots, and discovering that this acceptance, instead of being the most terrible thing in the world, is actually the most liberating. His followers genuinely love him, not the terrified devotion of Khorne's slaves, or the self-serving calculation of Tzeentch's disciples, or the addictive dependency of Slaanesh's devotees' actual warmth, actual gratitude. Because Nurgle's gifts, as horrifying as they look, actually deliver what they promise. His followers do not feel the pain of their diseases. They do not experience the horror of their own decay. They feel, consistently and genuinely, content. This is the most unsettling thing about Nurgle. His is the most human face of the four Chaos gods, and his offer is the one that, under sufficiently desperate circumstances, the most people could understand accepting. When you are dying and in agony, and your world has fallen apart and there is nothing left to hope for, Nurgle comes with warmth and acceptance, and asks only that you join him. And the people who take that offer do not regret it, even afterward. They cannot. Contentment, once fully granted by Nurgle, cannot be revoked. It is the god's gift that cannot be taken back. What does Nurgle want from the great game? At one level, the simplest answer is dominance through inevitability. Nurgle does not need to rush. He does not need to win a single decisive battle or achieve a particular strategic objective. He needs only to wait, because everything, given enough time, decays. Everything given enough time weakens and softens and eventually falls. The greatest fortress eventually crumbles. The most powerful empire eventually rots from within. The most perfectly maintained machine eventually seizes up and fails. This is entropy, the universe's fundamental tendency toward the dissolution of order into disorder, and Nurgle is its divine embodiment. He does not have to win the great game. He already knows he is going to win. He is just waiting for the others to figure it out. His primary rival is Tzeentch, and this rivalry is the most philosophically rich of the four pairings. The opposition between them is not merely strategic or temperamental, it is ontological. They represent fundamentally incompatible views of what reality is and what existence means. Nurgle says, everything decays. The path of things is toward dissolution. The correct response to this truth is acceptance, not passive resignation, but the active, warm, loving embrace of the cycle. Life feeds death, death feeds life, and the wheel turns. And that turning is not a tragedy, but a comfort, because it means that nothing is ever truly lost, only transformed. Nurgle's garden is not a wasteland. It is an ecosystem complex, teeming, full of life in the most literal sense, because rot and decay and disease are forms of life, as much as anything more conventionally alive. The maggots and the fungi and the bacteria that dismantle a corpse are not ending something, they are beginning something. They are the first participants in the next cycle. Tzeentch says, nothing is inevitable. Everything can be changed. The future is not written. The universe is not a machine running down to heat death. It is a living, dynamic, endlessly mutable system in which anything can become anything else, with sufficient application of will, knowledge, and cunning. Decay is not a fact about the universe, but a failure of imagination. The correct response to existence is not acceptance, but transformation. The constant striving to make things different, better, stranger, more complex, more interesting, more alive. Hope is not an illusion. It is the engine of change, and change is the only thing that is real. These two positions cannot be reconciled. They cannot be compromised between. They are mutually exclusive at the level of first principles. And so Nurgle and Tzeentch are, as the lore puts it, age-old enemies in a way that goes deeper than the Khorne-Slaanesh rivalry, which is fundamentally a personality clash. The Nurgle-Tzeentch conflict is a philosophical war about the nature of reality itself, conducted through the medium of daemonic armies and mortal champions, and plagues versus schemes, decay versus transformation, the garden versus the labyrinth. In the Great Game, this plays out practically, in ways that are fascinating to trace. Tzeentch's schemes constantly disrupt Nurgle's long, patient plans, introduce variables the Plaguefather had not accounted for, redirect the consequences of his plagues in directions that serve the Changer of Ways rather than the Lord of Decay. Nurgle's spreading corruption, conversely, drags at Tzeentch's elaborate constructions, introducing the entropy that makes plans fall apart at crucial moments, softening the intricate machinery of Tzeentchian schemes with the simple, implacable pressure of things decaying. There is also a temporal dimension to this rivalry that is worth pausing on. Nurgle operates on timescales that make even the Chaos Gods seem impatient. A plague that takes 1,000 years to fully bloom and consume a civilization is, from Nurgle's perspective, a thing moving at a pleasant pace. Tzeentch operates on the opposite principle: constant motion, constant change, nothing static for more than the time required to set up the next move. The conflict between them is partly a conflict between geological time and the pace of thought. Nurgle wins by waiting. Tzeentch wins by moving. And neither approach can fully overcome the other because they are responding to different aspects of reality, both of which are real. Nurgle's place in the Great Game at any given moment is directly tied to how much despair exists in the material universe. The 41st millennium is, in many respects, Nurgle's natural environment, an age of grinding hopelessness, of civilizations that have survived too long and grown too rigid, of populations that face threats so enormous and so relentless that despair is not a personal failing, but a rational response to observed reality. The Imperium of mankind is, at its core, a civilization in the advanced stages of Nurgle's preferred emotional climate, vast, decaying, maintained through sheer inertia more than genuine vitality, held together by the fear of what would happen if it fell apart, rather than any genuine hope of improvement. Every plague that sweeps an underhive, every world that falls to blight and sickness, every guardsman who gives in to the gray weight of pointlessness and accepts that nothing they do will ever matter. Each of these is a note in Nurgle's endless, satisfied humming. He does not need to conquer. He just needs to let time do what time always does. Section 6. Tezent, and the architect of infinite schemes. Tzeentch is the strangest of the four. Not merely strange in the way the others are strange. Khorne is terrifying, Nurgle is repulsive, Slaanesh is intoxicating but strange in a way that challenges comprehension at the level of logic itself. Because Tzeentch is the chaos god of change, of mutation, of the infinite proliferation of plans and counterplans and plans within plans, and the most consistent thing that anyone who digs deep enough into his lore discovers is this: Tzeentch does not want to win. Not really. Not in the sense of achieving any particular, stable outcome and then resting satisfied. Tzeentch wants the game to keep going. He wants the schemes to keep proliferating. He wants the possibilities to keep multiplying. He is, in a very literal sense, addicted to planning. Not because planning serves some larger purpose, but because planning is the purpose. The changer of ways is not scheming toward an endpoint. He is scheming because scheming is what he is. He would not know what to do with victory even if he somehow achieved it. Victory, in the sense of a final, stable arrangement of the universe that no longer required further manipulation, would be the equivalent of death to Tzeentch. It would be the end of change. And the end of change is the only thing the god of change genuinely cannot endure. The lore contains a fascinating philosophical puzzle nested in Tzeentch's nature. He is the god of hope as much as the god of manipulation. He is sustained by mortals' belief that things can be different, that the future is not fixed, that tomorrow does not have to be like today. Every scholar who dreams of knowledge they do not yet possess, every revolutionary who imagines a world other than the one they live in, every desperate person who refuses to accept that their situation is hopeless and keeps looking for the angle that might save them, all of these are feeding Tzeentch. Hope, even hope, that is doomed and naive and ultimately crushed, is Tzeentchian currency. But Tzeentch does not want hope to succeed. Hope succeeding would mean the situation changed, and the changed situation might become stable, and stable is exactly what Tzeentch cannot tolerate. What Tzeentch wants is hope perpetually frustrated, but never quite extinguished, a galaxy of beings who keep reaching for something better, keep believing change is possible, but whose grasp is always just short of what they're reaching for. A universe of perpetual almost. A cosmos of the next scheme, the next plan, the next gambit, that might finally be the one that works. This gives Tzeentch a uniquely parasitic relationship with the other three gods. All of their obsessions, Khorne's bloodlust, Nurgle's despair, Slaanesh's sensation hunger, are themselves things that Tzeentch can work with. Obsession of any kind creates predictable behavior, and predictable behavior is something a schemer can work around. Tzeentch's plans take the obsessions of his siblings as fixed variables to be accounted for and exploited, turning their strengths against them in ways they rarely see coming. Khorne, for example, can be maneuvered. His rage and his commitment to straightforward violence mean that if you present him with a sufficiently provocative target, he will charge it even if charging it serves Tzeentch's larger purpose. The lore contains specific examples of this. Tzeentch engineering situations that send Khorne's legions crashing into positions that benefit the Changer rather than the Blood God, while Khorne, lost in the red haze of battle joy, does not notice that he has been used until the moment is past and the damage is done. Nurgle is harder to maneuver because Nurgle is patient, in a way that resists Tzeentch's reliance on speed and complexity. You cannot confuse a being that is content to wait forever. You cannot overwhelm with complexity an entity that has all the time in existence and is not in any hurry. Tzeentch's plots against Nurgle tend to work at the level of introduction, adding a novel variable to Nurgle's slow and steady plans. A mutation here, a disruption there, something that forces the Garden to adapt in directions Nurgle had not intended. Tzeentch does not try to defeat Nurgle frontally. He tries to make Nurgle's inevitable victory take longer, and to extract benefit from the delay. Slaanesh is, surprisingly, something of an ally of Tzeentch in temperament. Both tend towards subtlety and indirect approaches, compared to Khorne's straightforward fury or Nurgle's unstoppable patience. The two will occasionally find themselves on the same side of a temporary arrangement, against Khorne or Nurgle, though Tzeentch's alliances with anyone are always riddled with concealed traps and secondary agendas that the alleged ally will discover too late. Tzeentch's relationship with mortal followers is among the most complex of the four gods. His blessings are genuine but unpredictable. A devoted follower of the Changer of Ways might receive mutations, magical power, forbidden knowledge, visions of the future, but they might also find that their blessing is the exact wrong thing for the situation they're in, or that the power they were given has a built-in cost they hadn't anticipated, or that the vision of the future they received was accurate, but the interpretation they gave it was wrong. Tzeentch gives gifts with fingers crossed behind his back. He rewards his followers, but on his own terms, in his own ways, according to his own purposes, which are rarely identical to the followers' purposes, even when they appear to be. The Thousand Sons, the Chaos Space Marine Legion devoted to Tzeentch, are the most vivid illustration of this. Magnus the Red, their Daemon Primarch, pursued knowledge with absolute devotion and was rewarded with the destruction of his entire legion, who were turned into hollow suits of armor, animated by dust, the so-called Rubric Marines. Ahriman, greatest of the Thousand Sons sorcerers, attempted to reverse this curse with a great ritual and succeeded only in making it permanent, though whether this is actually the outcome Tzeentch intended all along is, appropriately, entirely unclear. The Rubric Marines are themselves a metaphor for Tzeentch's followers in general. They have power. They have capability. They are, in many ways, impressive. But they are empty inside. The thing that makes life worth living, consciousness, will, the ability to change and grow and choose, has been removed, leaving only the form without the substance. And this is what serving Tzeentch ultimately delivers. The appearances of everything, the reality of nothing that does not serve the Changer's ongoing, endless, purposeless purposes. In the great game, Tzeentch is the variable. He is the element that makes it impossible for any simple pattern to persist. Left to themselves, the other three might eventually find a stable equilibrium of mutual destruction that would last for a long time. Tzeentch prevents this. His interference, his constant injection of new variables and new complications and new schemes, keeps the game genuinely game-like rather than letting it settle into anything resembling routine. He is, in a horrible way, the great game's most valuable participant, because he is the one who ensures it never gets boring, never gets stable, never stops producing the change and the hope and the frustrated ambition that feeds him. He might be the only Chaos God who genuinely needs the other three to exist, not just for the mechanical reason that they all need each other to sustain the warp, but because they are his material. They are what he schemes about. They are the variables he works with. Without them, what would Tzeentch plan? What would he change? What would he corrupt? Nothing. And nothing is the one thing Tzeentch cannot endure. Section 7. Slaanesh and the Youngest Hunger. There is something unique about Slaanesh that separates the Dark Prince from the other three in ways beyond merely being the youngest. The other three Chaos Gods emerged gradually, coalescing over vast stretches of time from the slow accumulation of mortal emotional output, growing from barely conscious storms of psychic energy into full sentience over millions or even billions of years. They are ancient in a way that has made them settled into their identities. They know what they are. They have been what they are for so long that it is no longer a matter of becoming, only of being. Slaanesh arrived differently. Slaanesh erupted. The birth of the Dark Prince was a catastrophic event on a cosmic scale, a singularity of sensation and desire, so intense that it tore open the fabric of reality and consumed an entire civilization in an instant. 10,000 years of increasingly extreme Eldari excess, the last few centuries of which were marked by acts of such profound depravity that entire planets of the most psychically attuned species in the galaxy had essentially become open conduits, pouring raw sensation directly into the warp. And then, in a single terrible moment, all of that accumulated energy crystallized into consciousness. Slaanesh was not born slowly. Slaanesh was detonated. This origin matters because it shapes what Slaanesh fundamentally is, in a way that differs from the other three. Khorne is defined by his age. He is the oldest of the four, ancient beyond comprehension. His rage settled into something almost geological in its solidity. Nurgle's long existence has made him patient, his contentment grounded in the certainty that comes from watching everything eventually decay. Tzeentch's centuries of scheming have made his plans genuinely labyrinthine, full of layers and contingencies that have been refined over eons. But Slaanesh, young, explosive, born from excess rather than accumulation, is defined by hunger. Bottomless, accelerating, never-satisfied hunger. The Dark Prince consumes sensation the way the other gods consume their specific emotional currency, but with an intensity and a dependency that makes the other's appetites look moderate. Every experience is temporary, every pleasure fades, every sensation grows familiar, and then grows dull, and then must be replaced with something more intense, more extreme, more previously unimaginable. This is the fundamental law of Slaanesh's existence. Enough is never enough. What was enough yesterday is not enough today, and tomorrow will demand something that today cannot even conceive. The spiral of escalation is not a flaw in Slaanesh's design. It is the design. The hunger that cannot be satisfied is the point. The seeking is the god, not the finding. For Slaanesh's followers, this plays out in ways that are initially seductive and ultimately catastrophic. The Dark Prince offers pleasure and delivers it, genuinely delivers it, more intensely than any mortal experience could naturally provide. But each experience raises the threshold. What once brought ecstasy becomes merely pleasant. What was pleasant becomes neutral. What was neutral becomes actively uncomfortable. And the follower, chasing the experience that will restore that first glorious hit, is drawn further and further into extremity, until the things they are willing to do for sensation bear no resemblance to anything a normal person would recognize. This is Slaanesh's recruitment mechanism, and it is extraordinarily effective because the initial offer is not a lie. The pleasure is real. It is the trajectory that is hidden. In the Great Game, Slaanesh occupies a position that is interesting because it is younger and in some ways smaller than the other three, yet still capable of significant influence. The lore notes that Slaanesh cannot yet hold its own against any one other major chaos god in direct confrontation in a straight power versus power clash. Slaanesh would be overmatched by Khorne or Nurgle or Tzeentch individually, but Slaanesh's influence in the game is disproportionate to their raw power because of a specific talent the Dark Prince possesses that the others lack, the ability to manipulate the obsessions of rivals. Khorne's bloodlust is a compulsion. Nurgle's desire to spread decay and illness is a compulsion. Tzeentch's need to scheme is a compulsion. All three of these obsessions are, in their own way, susceptible to exploitation by an entity that understands obsession at a molecular level, that was born from excess, and has spent its entire existence studying how desires work and how they can be redirected. Slaanesh can offer Khorne's champions the thrill of violence taken to a sensory extreme that pure martial violence does not reach. Slaanesh can whisper to Nurgle's followers about the strange pleasure of the senses that decay provides, gently pulling them toward a more Slaaneshi flavor of corruption. Slaanesh can offer Tzeentch's disciples the ecstasy of forbidden knowledge, the sensation of knowing what others do not. In this way, Slaanesh constantly poaches subtly, artfully, the way the Dark Prince does everything from the follower bases of the other three. The lore notes that the other gods fear Slaanesh, quietly and without openly admitting it. Because while it is easy to see and resist the approaches of a god that demands blood or infection or conspiracy, it is much harder to resist the approach of a god that speaks in the language of your own desires and offers to give you what you already want, only more so. Slaanesh relationship with the Eldari gives the Dark Prince a particular character in the material universe that the other gods do not share. She who thirsts the name the Eldari give Slaanesh, because they will not speak the true name, is the perpetual predator of the Eldari soul. Every Eldari who dies, unless they take extraordinary precautions, has their soul immediately consumed by Slaanesh. This is not metaphorical, it is mechanical. The Eldari's extreme psychic potency makes their souls extraordinarily valuable to the warp's predatory entities, and Slaanesh, who was born from the accumulated essence of the Eldari civilization, has a specific claim on them that makes the consumption of their souls particularly smooth and complete. The Eldari craft world societies, the Exodites, the Harlequins, their entire cultures are organized, in large part, around the project of not being eaten by Slaanesh. The spirit stones they wear, the techniques they use to transfer dying consciousness into craft world infinity circuits, the Harlequin relationship with the laughing god Segarash, all of this is the Eldari's ongoing strategy for keeping their souls out of the Dark Prince's endless hunger. It does not always work, and when it fails, Slaanesh feeds on the most psychically potent beings in the galaxy. This is why, despite being the youngest, Slaanesh is growing. The Eldari are finite, and they die every time there is a battle, and every death is a meal. Over the 10,000 years since the fall, Slaanesh has consumed an enormous quantity of Eldari essence that the other gods cannot claim. It is one of the reasons the Eldari are a dying species, not merely because of their low reproduction rate and the losses of war, but because their god is eating them one by one, and there is only so long that strategy can continue before there are none left. Section 8. The specific rivalries in detail. The Great Game has a particular structure to its rivalries that is worth examining carefully, because it is not simply four gods all hating each other equally. There are two specific pairings of particular enmity, Khorne against Slaanesh and Tzeentch against Nurgle, and these pairings define the primary axes around which the Great Game rotates. The Khorne-Slaanesh rivalry has already been touched on, but it deserves deeper consideration. These two are the most viscerally opposed of the four pairings, and their conflict plays out with an energy that the other pairing lacks. Where Tzeentch and Nurgle are locked in a cold philosophical war of fundamentally incompatible worldviews, Khorne and Slaanesh fight with the hot, personal, almost contemptuous intensity of two beings who find each other genuinely infuriating at an instinctive level. Khorne cannot tolerate what Slaanesh represents because it is a direct insult to everything he values. The Blood God's entire identity is built around the idea that what matters is the quality of the struggle, the honesty of facing something dangerous and conquering it through strength. Slaanesh's approach, which involves seduction and manipulation and the corruption of enemies through their own desires rather than direct confrontation, seems to Khorne like the most profound form of cowardice. Not even the cowardice of hiding from danger, but the cowardice of making danger unnecessary by subverting your opponents before they can mount any real resistance. To Khorne, this approach is not merely ineffective, it is morally disgusting, in a way that Tzeentch's schemes or Nurgle's patience never quite rise to. Slaanesh, for their part, finds Khorne's dedication to straightforward violence deeply boring. The Blood God is, from the Dark Prince's perspective, a creature of extraordinarily limited imagination capable of only one thing, endlessly repeating that one thing, refusing to discover the infinite richness of sensation and experience that lies beyond simple blood and fury. Slaanesh also takes a specific, pointed pleasure in corrupting Khorne's champions, in finding the cracks in their martial dedication and prying them open with pleasure. A Khornate champion who has sworn themselves to blood and fury alone is, to Slaanesh, a delicious challenge. Can the Dark Prince find the one sensation that breaks through the blood, God's followers' resistance, and starts them down a different path? In the material universe, these two factions clash with particular ferocity. Cults dedicated to Khorne and Slaanesh are, per the lore, especially prone to direct violence against each other, more so than other inter-chaos conflicts. When a Khornate warband encounters a Slaaneshi one, the Blood God's warriors often react with something that goes beyond tactical hostility into genuine fury, and the Slaaneshi respond with equal intensity. Their disdain for the crude, blood-soaked simplicity of Khorne's servants, sharpening into a desire to prove that their way is more powerful. The Tzeentch-Nurgle pairing is philosophically richer, but temperamentally cooler. These two do not hate each other with the hot intensity of Khorne and Slaanesh. They regard each other with something more like fundamental mutual incomprehension, the inability to even understand why the other exists the way it does. Nurgle, who has accepted the nature of things and finds peace in that acceptance, cannot comprehend why Tzeentch refuses to accept anything, why the Changer insists on introducing variability and possibility into situations that Nurgle can already see the outcome of. And Tzeentch, who believes that all outcomes are uncertain until they occur, and that the future is always available to be reshaped by sufficient will, cannot comprehend how Nurgle's philosophy is not simply advanced nihilism, the surrender of intelligence to inevitability, the abandonment of thought in favor of rot. Mechanically, in the Great Game, these two are always working against each other. Nurgle's plagues, given enough time, inevitably kill the very beings that Tzeentch wants to scheme through, and with you, cannot manipulate a corpse, cannot inspire hope in something already dissolved by infection. Nurgle's patient decay eats at the complex systems that Tzeentch relies on, the political structures, the scholarly institutions, the networks of conspiracy that his followers build and inhabit. A city deep enough into Nurgle's corruption becomes too broken and too hopeless to be a viable arena for Tzeentchian machination. Tzeentch responds to this by introducing variables into Nurgle's plague's mutations that send them in unexpected directions, schemes that ensure the plagues produce chaos rather than the steady decay Nurgle prefers. A plague that kills too fast or too efficiently is actually bad for Nurgle's purposes, because dead civilizations stop generating despair, stop producing the living people whose helplessness in the face of disease is what Nurgle feeds on. Tzeentch sometimes engineers situations where Nurgle's plagues burn through populations too quickly, actually limiting the Plague Father's power by removing the host before the slow emotional harvest can complete. It is a distinctly Tzeentchian form of sabotage, using the victim's own mechanism against them. There are secondary rivalries as well. Khorne's antipathy toward Tzeentch is real, fueled by the Blood God's contempt for sorcery, and the Changer's love of it. Nurgle and Slaanesh have their own complex relationship. They are perhaps the least directly antagonistic pairing, since Nurgle's slow rot and Slaanesh's pleasure-seeking are not as directly contradictory as the primary rival pairings, though they are certainly not allies. Slaanesh finds Nurgle repulsive in an aesthetic sense, which is saying something from the god of excess. Nurgle regards Slaanesh with something that might almost be pity, all that desperate chasing of sensation, never finding peace, never accepting the comfort of decay. And then there is the way alliances form and dissolve in the Great Game, which never last more than the minimum time required to address whatever immediate threat precipitated them. The canonical example of the four gods working together is the Horus Heresy, when the threat of the Emperor of Mankind's growing power, specifically the imperial truth that was systematically dismantling the emotional chaos that fed the warp, caused all four gods to temporarily set aside their conflicts and cooperate to engineer the betrayal that brought the heresy about. But even in that cooperation, the seeds of the next betrayal were being planted. Each god was already thinking about what came next, how to use the heresy's aftermath for their own advantage, how to ensure that when the truce ended, they would be better positioned than when it began. The Horus Heresy itself, and especially its aftermath, shows this dynamic perfectly. The traitor legions, despite being in the same nominal faction, were already fighting each other by the time they reached Terra, their conflicting loyalties to different gods, producing conflicts that undermined the coordinated assault. And in the aftermath, when the Chaos Gods could simply have pressed the attack and consumed a weakened Imperium before it could recover, they did not cooperate. Instead, each pursued their own agenda, carving out new territories in the warp bloated with the enormous psychic outpouring of the heresy, meddling with each other's new conquests, trying to position themselves advantageously for the next cycle of the Great Game. And the Imperium survived, scarred and diminished, but survived. This is the single greatest tactical failure of chaos in the 41st millennium, and arguably in the entire history of the Great Game's impact on the material universe. If the gods had worked together for even another century, the Imperium would not exist. But cooperation is not in their nature. The Great Game demanded their attention, and they answered its call. Section 9. How the Great Game bleeds into real space. Most of the time, the Great Game is exactly what it sounds like, a game, or rather, the most serious war conceivable, but conducted within the warp. Its battles are fought in places that exist only in the immaterium, between forces composed of psychic energy, across landscapes made of raw emotion. The material universe, the galaxy of planets and stars and civilizations and wars, is, from the perspective of the gods themselves, a secondary concern. The Great Game demands most of their attention, most of the time, in ways that make the affairs of even the most powerful mortal civilizations seem trivial. But the game does bleed outward. It bleeds into real space in multiple ways, and understanding these bleeds is essential to understanding why the galaxy of Warhammer 40K looks the way it does, why its conflicts have the character they have, why the forces of chaos behave as they do, why a seemingly unstoppable supernatural power keeps failing to actually consume the material universe, despite having every apparent advantage. The most direct form of bleed is demonic incursion. When the conditions are right, when a region of space is sufficiently soaked in the right kind of psychic energy, when the barrier between the warp and the material universe has been weakened by war or ritual or catastrophic psychic events, the demonic armies of the chaos gods can push directly into real space. They cannot maintain this presence indefinitely. The material universe's physical laws are fundamentally hostile to their purely psychic constitution, and without continuous ritual reinforcement or some local source of warp energy to stabilize them, demons fade back into the immaterium after a period. But during that period, they fight both against the defenders of whatever territory they've invaded and against each other, because the Great Game does not pause simply because the battlefield happens to be located in a dimension with physics. A demonic incursion is not a unified assault. It is a chaos, in the most literal sense, of competing factions, each answering to a different god, each pursuing different objectives, often actively undermining each other's efforts, even while ostensibly serving the same broad goal of destroying the material realm's capacity to resist. A Tsientian daemon force arriving to support a Khornate invasion might end up sabotaging it because the Changer of Ways has decided that Khorne growing too dominant is a worse outcome than the invasion failing. A Nurglite force invited into an alliance against the Imperium might find themselves more interested in infecting their Slaaneshi nominal allies than in actually prosecuting the campaign they were called to assist with. This is why the Imperium of Man still exists in the 41st millennium. Not because human civilization is strong enough to withstand the full, united attention of all four Chaos gods. It is not even close. But chaos is not united, has never been united, will never be united for more than the most temporary and contingency-driven intervals. The Great Game guarantees that even chaos's assault on the material universe is perpetually self-sabotaged by the mutual hostility of its four principles. The mortal champions of the Chaos Gods, the Chaos Space Marines, the corrupted warlords, the demon princes who walk the line between human and divine, are in many ways the most important pieces on the Great Game's board, as it extends into real space. They are the instruments through which the gods pursue their agendas without being directly present, and they carry the conflicts of the warp with them onto every battlefield in the material universe. When the Iron Warriors nominally aligned with Chaos Undivided, though they have their own particular affinities clash with the World Eaters in some corner of the Eye of Terror, this is not merely a squabble between traitor legions. It is a physical expression of the Great Game played out through human bodies and bolters and chain axes. Every such clash generates power for the relevant gods and translates back into shifts in the warp's political geography. The Black Crusades of Abaddon, the Despoiler, are perhaps the most famous example of how the Great Game structures even the most significant events in real space. Abaddon, as a servant of Chaos Undivided, nominally pledging himself to all four gods rather than any specific one, is theoretically in a better position than anyone to coordinate the forces of chaos toward a common goal. And the Black Crusades have, over their 13 confirmed occurrences, achieved genuine results: the destruction of worlds, the corruption of systems, the gradual wearing down of the Imperium's defenses, and eventually, With the 13th Black Crusade, the tearing open of the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, that split the galaxy in half. But even Abaddon's crusades cannot fully overcome the Great Game's interference. The traitor legions that follow different gods will cooperate with each other, only to the degree that their specific god's interests align with the Crusade's objectives. When those interests diverge, and they always diverge, eventually the coalition fractures. Champions who should be driving together toward a common objective find themselves unable to resist striking at each other, because the Great Game never sleeps, and the instincts it has bred into them over 10,000 years in the Eye of Terror do not switch off simply because there is a larger campaign in progress. The Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, is the most dramatic recent example of the Great Game bleeding catastrophically into real space. The rift's opening during the 13th Black Crusade was, in one sense, a triumph of chaos, an enormous galaxy-spanning tear in reality through which the warp poured constantly, reshaping entire sectors of space and making travel and communication across the galaxy dramatically more difficult. It represented 10,000 years of accumulated chaos schemes, finally reaching a kind of macro-structural fruition. But even in the aftermath of this triumph, the Great Game resumed immediately. The lore describes the Chaos Gods, each viewing the Great Rift not as a shared achievement to be consolidated, but as an opportunity to advance their own position at the expense of the others. Khorne directed his blood legions toward new territories. Nurgle's Scourge Stars bloomed in the warp-soaked spaces. Tzientch's schemes proliferated through the confusion. Slaaneish's influence crept through the shattered defenses of worlds left vulnerable by the rift's disruption. And all four of them were simultaneously working against each other's exploitation of the situation. The result is that even the rift, this galaxy-shattering catastrophe, has not enabled chaos to finish the job. The Imperium, reeling and split and desperately overstretched, has nonetheless managed to survive the immediate aftermath, partly through its own resilience and partly through the simple fact that its enemies are too busy fighting each other to finish what they started. Section 10. Malice, the renegade god, and the chaos that turns on itself. There is a name that even the most devoted servants of the four chaos gods do not speak freely, not because they fear their own patron, that kind of fear is built into the relationship from the start, but because this name refers to something that makes even those who have given everything to the ruinous powers uncomfortable. Something that sits outside the Great Game's four-player structure and does something that should, by the logic of chaos, be impossible. Malice, also called the Outcast God, the Renegade God, the Lost God, the Hierarch of Anarchy and Terror, is a fifth power in the warp, or rather, a fifth power that was perhaps once part of the four, or perhaps grew from the same soil as the four, or perhaps represents what chaos becomes when it turns on itself so completely that it becomes its own opposing force. The lore is deliberately unclear on the specifics, and this ambiguity is itself appropriate. Malice is, at a conceptual level, the embodiment of chaos, refusing to even follow the rules of being chaos. Where the four chaos gods embody specific emotional states, rage, decay, change, sensation, Malice embodies something stranger and more abstract, the tendency of chaos towards self-destruction. The anarchic impulse that does not care about the Great Game's rules, does not want to win in any sense the other four would recognize, has no interest in expanding its domain or accumulating souls, or feeding on mortal emotions in any structured way. Malice wants to cause chaos, not the capitalized chaos of the ruinous powers, but lowercase chaos, entropy, the undoing of all structures, including the structures of chaos itself. His followers, such as they are, few in number and extreme, even by chaos standards, war not only against the Imperium, but against the servants of the other chaos gods. They wear the colors of malice in their stark black and white. They carry weapons blessed to be especially effective against demonic entities, and they pursue a path of destruction so indiscriminate that even chaos cultists regard them with unease. The Sons of Malice, the only dedicated Chaos Space Marine chapter known to serve him, were excommunicated from the Imperium for rituals so extreme that even the standard categories of Chaos heresy struggled to contain them, and they are noted to fight against other Chaos servants with the same ferocity they bring to fighting the Imperium. The nature of Malice's power is unusual. Unlike the other four gods, who grow in power as the emotions that sustain them increase in the material universe, Malice's power is parasitic on the great game itself. He grows larger as the other four grow larger, feeding on the energy they generate rather than generating his own. He is chaos, turned against chaos, the renegade who serves no master, not even the abstract principle that the other four serve. In the great game, Malice is not a player, in the normal sense. The four major gods are aware of him, and the lore suggests they fear him in a way they do not quite fear each other, because each of the four at least understands what the others want and can plan around it. Malice is genuinely unpredictable in a way that makes the four's behavior seem structured and rational by comparison. He has no agenda that can be modeled and countered. He has no followers that can be subverted. He has no territory in the warp that can be invaded, because his presence there is more like a cancer than a kingdom, something that grows in the tissue of the other four's domains, rather than existing as an independent space. The most interesting thing about Malice, from a thematic perspective, is what he represents as a concept. He is the answer to the question, what is chaos, really, at its most essential? The four chaos gods, for all their horror and power, are in a strange sense ordered. They have goals, they have followers, they have aesthetics and philosophies and preferences. They have, however, alien, something like personalities. This is chaos that has been given shape by the emotions that feed it, given character, given specificity. Malice is what you get when you strip away the shape and the specificity and the character and keep only the raw principle. Destruction for its own sake, dissolution without purpose, the end of all things, including the ending itself. If the four chaos gods represent what happens when mortal emotion becomes divine, Malice represents what happens when divinity becomes nothing but the refusal of existence. He is the fifth note in the symphony, the one that should not be there, the dissonance that the other four cannot harmonize away because it comes from inside the harmony itself. The lore's treatment of Malice is incomplete, and deliberately so he is explicitly identified as something the other four try to forget about, something that exists in the margins of their consciousness as an irritant and an unease. This is appropriate. Some things are more unsettling when left at the edges of understanding than when brought into full light. Section 11, the paradox, at the heart of the great game. We have been circling something this entire time, returning to it from different angles, and now it is time to address it directly. The central paradox of the great game is not merely that no one can win. It is something deeper and stranger, and more philosophically unsettling than that. The chaos gods need each other, not in the way that rivals sometimes turn out to need each other as motivation and opposition, not in the psychological sense where a hero needs a villain to give their virtue meaning. The chaos gods need each other in a structural, mechanical, existential sense. If any one of them ceased to exist, the others would be weakened almost immediately. Not because they would mourn the loss of their rival, they would not, but because the dynamic tension between them is what keeps the warp alive in the way that they require it to be alive. Think about this from Khorne's perspective for a moment. Khorne is the god of war and blood and martial fury. His power grows when mortals fight and kill. But what creates the conditions for sustained war? What keeps civilizations in conflict rather than allowing any one side to simply overwhelm the other and end the fighting? Partly, it is the nature of the universe. There will always be resource competition, always be territorial drives, always be the impulse toward dominance that leads to conflict. But also partly, it is Tzeentch, the changer of ways, constantly introducing new variables, constantly ensuring that no side in any conflict grows strong enough to achieve decisive victory, constantly undermining the conditions that would allow peace to break out. Tzeentch, whether intentionally or as a byproduct of his fundamental nature, ensures that wars never quite end, that the conditions for renewed conflict are always present, that the universe never settles into a stable peace that would allow Khorne to starve. And Nurgle's despair, the emotional climate of hopelessness and decay, is itself a driver of violence. People who have given up on the future do not invest in building things. They turn to destruction. They fight each other over diminishing resources. They give way to the violence of despair. Nurgle's influence, in this perverse way, generates the emotional substrate from which Khorne feeds. And Slaaneish's excess, the willingness to pursue sensation at any cost, including violence, produces a specific kind of conflict that is particularly pure from Khorne's perspective. The conflict of those who fight for the thrill of it, for the sensation of power and dominance, caring nothing for the consequences. The four gods do not merely oppose each other, they sustain each other. Each one's nature creates the conditions in which the others can flourish, even as each one is working to diminish the others. This is the loop at the heart of the great game, not a simple loop of opposition, but a complex, multi-directional web of mutual dependency wrapped in mutual hostility. And what does this mean for the material universe? For the galaxy of Warhammer 40K, with all its billions of living beings going about the business of existing in the most terrible conditions imaginable, it means that chaos, for all its horror and power, is self-limiting. The great game ensures that no single chaos god ever achieves the kind of total, unchallengeable dominion over the material universe that would allow it to simply consume everything and end the story. Every time one of the four approaches that kind of dominance, the others pull it back. Every time chaos seems poised to finally overwhelm the galaxy's defenses, the internal conflicts of the great game fracture the assault. The Eye of Terror has existed for 10,000 years as a massive warp rift through which an unimaginable force of demonic power could theoretically be poured into the material universe, and in all that time, the chaos forces in it have fought each other more consistently than they have fought the Imperium. This is cold comfort, because the Chaos Gods are doing extraordinary damage, regardless. The slow consumption of human civilization, the corruption of worlds, the endless wars that drain the Imperium of the strength it needs to face its many other enemies, all of this is real and terrible and ongoing. But it has not ended everything, and the reason it has not ended everything is that the great game will not allow it. The very nature of chaos prevents chaos from winning. There is a philosophical reading of this that is almost poignant, if you can apply a word like poignant to something so vast and so horrifying. The Chaos Gods are prisoners. They are the most powerful beings in the galaxy, entities of incomprehensible scale and ancient, terrible intelligence, and they are absolutely trapped. Trapped by their own natures, trapped by the dynamic that sustains them, trapped in a war they cannot win and cannot stop, fighting for a prize that would destroy them if they claimed it. They have no freedom, they have no choice, they are what they are, doing what they must do, forever. The great game is not a game in any sense that involves strategy leading to victory. It is a pattern. It is what happens when incompatible emotional forces of sufficient size and intelligence are placed in proximity to each other, in a dimension that reflects and amplifies everything they are. It is the universe's emotional immune system eating itself. It is the dark reflection of every feeling that conscious beings have ever had, made huge and hostile and eternal. And the tragedy of it, if tragedy is the right word, is that it cannot end. Not because the gods are powerful, but because the feelings that made them are inextinguishable. As long as there is rage anywhere in the universe, Khorne exists. As long as there is death and the fear of it, Nurgle persists. As long as there is hope and ambition, Tzeentch endures. As long as there is desire and sensation, Slaanesh hungers. And these things will never end, because they are not consequences of civilization or of war or of any particular arrangement of events in the material universe. They are consequences of consciousness itself, of what it means to be a thinking, feeling being alive in an uncertain universe. The Chaos Gods will exist until the last conscious being in the galaxy dies, and, in the grim darkness of the far future, that end is not in sight. Section 12. Why this matters and what it means for the galaxy. We have been through a great deal of ground together, from the nature of the warp itself, through the birth of the gods, through the mechanics of the great game and the specific natures and rivalries of the four Chaos Gods, through the way the game bleeds into the material universe and the strange figure of malice at the game's edges. Let us stand back now and look at what all of this means not for the fictional universe of Warhammer 40K, but for what makes that universe resonate the way it does. Because there is a reason that the Chaos Gods work as mythology even for people who have never played the tabletop game, never read a Black Library novel, never painted a single miniature. There is a reason that when you explain the four Chaos Gods to someone who has never encountered them before, You can see them immediately grasp the emotional logic of the concepts: rage, decay, manipulation, excess. These are not alien feelings. These are the most human feelings in the world. The genius of the Chaos Gods, as a creative construction, is that they are not external to the people they threaten. They are made of those people. Humanity did not stumble into a universe that happened to contain ancient, hostile gods. Humanity created those gods, fed them, sustained them, and is in a very real sense responsible for their continuing existence. Every act of anger that you have ever felt contributed, in the most infinitesimally small way, to Khorne. Every moment of genuine hopelessness nourished Nurgle. Every ambition, every hunger for knowledge or power or change fed Seanch. Every indulgence, every pursuit of sensation added something to Slaanesh. This is why the Imperium of Man cannot simply destroy chaos the way it can destroy an Ork warband or blockade a Tau expansion. Chaos is not an external threat in the way those other factions are external threats. It is an internal one. It is what the Imperium's own population generates every day, just by existing, just by feeling, just by being the kind of creatures they are. The Emperor's original plan, during the Great Crusade, was not to destroy chaos directly that was recognized as impossible, but to change the conditions that fed it. To build a civilization so rational, so scientifically grounded, so free of the superstition and religious fervor that the Chaos Gods feast on, that the emotional outpouring into the warp would diminish below the threshold required to sustain the gods. To starve them by changing humanity. That plan failed. The Horus Heresy ensured it failed. And the irony is that the heresy, the greatest victory the Chaos Gods ever achieved against the Imperium, was itself the product of the Great Game's logic. Even in cooperating to bring about the Emperor's downfall, the gods were already positioning for the resumption of their conflict with each other. They used humanity to fight their war, and humanity has been paying the price for 10,000 years. The Great Game is, at its most fundamental level, a story about the cost of consciousness. About the fact that to think and to feel is to generate something in the universe to leave a trace, to create ripples, to contribute to forces larger than yourself in ways you cannot control and may not even be aware of. Every sentient being in the galaxy of Warhammer 40K is, without their knowledge or consent, a participant in the Great Game. They are feeding it with every moment of their lives. And the gods that their collective feelings have created are turning those feelings into a weapon against them. This is the horror that distinguishes chaos from the other threats in the setting. The Tyranids are terrifying, but they are external. They come from outside the galaxy. They want nothing that could be called a relationship with what they consume. The Necrons are terrifying, but they are historical, ancient, and returning, but at least with comprehensible goals of restoration and dominance. Chaos is different. Chaos is intimate. Chaos is the part of you that you try not to think about, given form and given malice, and given 10,000 years to learn how to use what it knows about you. In the end, the Great Game is not a conflict between gods. It is a conflict within consciousness itself, between the aspects of mortal nature that cannot be reconciled, the drive to fight and the drive to rest, the desire for change and the comfort of stasis, the hunger for sensation and the yearning for peace. The four Chaos Gods are not external to this conflict. They are it. They are what that conflict looks like when it achieves sufficient scale to become self-aware. And the reason no one can win the Great Game is the same reason no mortal being can fully resolve these contradictions within themselves. You cannot purge all rage and remain human. You cannot eliminate the fear of death and remain conscious of your own mortality. You cannot stop hoping for change without losing something essential. You cannot entirely shut down sensation without shutting down life. The Chaos Gods exist because the feelings that made them cannot be abolished, only managed, only lived with, only accepted as part of what it means to be alive in an uncertain universe. The Great Game will last as long as consciousness lasts. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, that is a very, very long time indeed. There is something quietly devastating in that thought. Something that the best Warhammer 40K lore sits with rather than trying to resolve. The universe of the 41st millennium is not going to get better. The Chaos Gods are not going to be defeated. The war is not going to end. The great game will continue to bleed into real space, will continue to corrupt and consume, will continue to generate the conflicts that feed it, will continue to find in the feelings of every living being the fuel for its own perpetuation. But consciousness also generated something else. It generated the Imperium, flawed and brutal and grinding as it is, and the stubborn refusal of human beings, and Eldari and Tau and countless others to simply stop resisting and be consumed. It generated the Space Marines and the Inquisition and the Adeptus Sororitas, and every soldier who put on their boots and walked into the dark knowing they would probably not come back. It generated, in other words, the opposition. And while that opposition cannot win in any final sense, cannot defeat the Chaos Gods permanently, cannot end the great game, it can sustain itself. It can continue. It can refuse, day after day and decade after decade and millennium after millennium, to simply give up. In the grim darkness of the far future, resistance is not victory. It is just resistance. But in a universe where the gods themselves are prisoners of their own natures, where even the mightiest powers in existence are trapped in cycles they cannot escape, there is perhaps something worth admiring in the simpler, more stubborn dignity of beings that choose to fight, even without the prospect of winning. Not for glory, not for the reward of victory, just because stopping is not something they are willing to do. That, maybe, is the one thing the great game cannot account for. If you made it all the way through this, that genuinely means something. Thank you for spending this time in the deep lore with me. If this is the kind of content you want to see more of, please subscribe if you haven't yet, and hit the like button. It helps far more than most people realize, and it lets me know that deep dives like this are worth making. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what the time is there right now. I read everything, and I love knowing where this is reaching. And if there is a specific piece of Warhammer 40K lore you want explored in this style, leave it in the comments. The next video is already in the works. Until then, rest well and keep your Geller fields strong. Section 13. The Domains of the Gods and what they tell us. To truly understand what each Chaos God is fighting for, you need to spend some time inside their domains. Not literally that way lies madness and worse, but conceptually, because the realm of chaos that each god inhabits is not a separate place that the god chose to move into. It is an expression of what the god is, given physical form. The domain and the deity are one and the same thing, rendered in a geography that mortal minds can barely process. Consider Khorne's domain first. It is called the Blood God's Domain, or sometimes the Brass Wastes, and its imagery is exactly what you would expect. Vast, blood-soaked plains under skies of permanent red dawn, the bones of defeated enemies and fallen champions alike ground into the earth underfoot, a landscape that looks like the aftermath of every battle ever fought, laid over itself 1,000,000 times until it became the only terrain that exists. At the center of this domain stands the Skull Throne itself, a construction so enormous that it defies mortal comprehension of scale, built from the skulls of every worthy warrior who has ever died in Khorne's name, or been killed by Khorne's champions, or simply fallen in combat of sufficient intensity and commitment to attract the Blood God's notice. And at its summit, the Blood God himself. But look more carefully at the Skull Throne and what it means. It is not merely a monument to slaughter. It is the most literal possible representation of what Khorne is trying to accomplish in the Great Game. Every skull on that mountain is a unit of power, a mortal soul that has been consumed, its essence added to Khorne's own. The mountain grows every day. Every war fought anywhere in the galaxy contributes to it. And the height of the mountain is a direct representation of Khorne's current standing in the Great Game. When he is dominant, the mountain grows fast and the throne sits high. When he is diminished, the growth slows. This is why Khorne does not merely want blood in the abstract. He wants the specific blood of specific quality of combat, because the skulls on his throne are not interchangeable. A skull taken from a worthy opponent in honest combat sits higher and means more than a skull taken from a helpless victim. The architecture of Khorne's domain is a record of the quality of his fighting across all of time, and he cares about the record. He is not merely a being screaming for sensation. He is a connoisseur of violence with an enormous and very specific aesthetic. The forges of Khorne that burn in the depths of his domain, where the master artisans of the Blood God, the masters of the Hellforges, craft weapons of extraordinary power from iron and boiling brass, and the enslaved souls of those who dared invade his realm. These, too, are part of the record. They are testament to what Khorne values beyond the raw act of killing: preparation, craft, the seriousness with which a warrior approaches the business of war. The weapons forged in Khorne's Hellforges are not random instruments of destruction. They are made with a purpose that reflects the blood god's deepest nature. They are tools of challenge, of confrontation, of the direct and honest application of force against a resisting enemy. When Khorne's champions carry these weapons into the great game's material theater, they carry with them not just destructive power, but a philosophy of engagement. Khorne demands that his enemies be faced. He does not respect ambush for its own sake, though he will use it when necessary. He does not respect poison or disease as primary instruments, though he tolerates them as supplements to blade and fist. What he demands is the confrontation, the moment when two forces meet, and the stronger, the more committed, the more truly dedicated to the act of war, prevails. This is what distinguishes Khorne's domain from the others, in terms of what the great game means to him. He is not trying to achieve a philosophical victory. He is not trying to prove a point about the nature of reality. He is trying to establish, empirically and through demonstrated evidence, that his approach, direct, violent, committed, stripped of all subterfuge, is superior to the approaches of the other three. Every skull on the throne is a data point in that argument. The mountain's height is his proof. And the great game, for Khorne, is the process by which that proof is gathered. Now move from the brass wastes to the crystalline corridors of Tzeentch's domain, and the contrast is almost physically shocking. Where Khorne's realm is red and simple and direct, Tzeentch's is a place of impossible complexity and constant flux. The impossible fortress, the name given to the central structure of Tzeentch's domain, though fortress is almost laughably inadequate for what it actually is, defies consistent description because it never occupies the same configuration for more than a moment. Its towers spiral through geometries that have no names in the languages of mortal mathematics. Its corridors lead to rooms that were not adjacent to them a moment ago and will not be adjacent to them a moment from now. Its windows look out onto vistas that should not exist from those angles, revealing spaces that are inside when they should be outside and outside when they should be in. Within this fortress, within the labyrinth of crystals and impossible spaces, Tzeentch's daemons scheme with a fervor that would be exhausting to watch from outside, and is presumably exhausting to participate in from within. But here is what the domain tells us about Tzeentch's goals in the great game, that the surface-level characterization of him as a manipulative schemer does not convey. There is no end state. The fortress has no room that is the final room, no corridor that leads to a conclusion. Every path through it leads to more paths. Every scheme that completes reveals the next scheme that it was preliminary to. The domain is literally designed in a way that makes arriving anywhere impossible, because arrival implies finality, and finality implies an end to change, and the end of change is the one thing this domain will not permit. What does this tell us about what Tzeentch wants from the great game? It confirms what we have already discussed, that Tzeentch does not want to win in any conventional sense, but it also suggests something more specific. Tzeentch wants the great game to be more complex. He wants more variables, more contingencies, more nested levels of scheme and counter-scheme. Every time he introduces a new complication into the game, every time he turns an apparently simple situation into a three-dimensional puzzle with hidden layers, he is making the game more like his domain. He is, in a sense, trying to transform the great game itself into the impossible fortress, a conflict so complex that no single outcome is ever truly final, where every apparent resolution opens onto the next layer of unrevealed complexity. Nurgle's garden has already been described, but there is more to say about what it reveals. The garden is not just beautiful in a disturbing way, it is purposeful. Every disease Nurgle creates is cultivated in the garden before being released into the material universe. Every new plague is a garden specimen, tended with care, developed over centuries or millennia, until it is exactly what Nurgle wants it to be. The process of plague creation in Nurgle's garden is described in the lore with a tenderness that is genuinely unsettling. the Plague Father examining his newest concoctions with an excitement and pride that any mortal artisan would recognize, sharing them with favored daemons who sample them and provide feedback, refining and developing them further. This tells us something important about Nurgle's relationship to the Great Game, that the straightforward narrative of God of Decay wants everything to rot misses. Nurgle is not passive. He is not simply waiting for entropy to do his work. He is actively creating, actively developing, actively investing time and attention, and something that functions emotionally like love, into the process of making the most perfect plague possible, the most complete expression of the cycle of decay and renewal. He is an artist, in his way the most patient and the most dedicated kind of artist, one who measures his creative timeline in geological epochs and finds this entirely comfortable. And Slaaneish's palace. We have touched on this domain already, but its architecture deserves more detailed attention because it is one of the most thematically rich creations in the entire setting. The Palace of Slaanesh, also called the Dark Prince's Realm, is arranged in concentric rings. The outer rings are accessible to mortals who happen to wander into Slaanesh's influence, places of extraordinary but comprehensible beauty, sensation that is intense but not overwhelming, experiences that feel like the absolute peak of what the material universe could offer. Moving inward, each ring intensifies. Each one is more extreme, more overwhelming, more capable of consuming the visitor's entire attention and leaving nothing else. By the innermost rings, the experiences available are so far beyond anything that mortal neurology was designed to process, that the visitors there are no longer entirely persons, in any meaningful sense. They are more like instruments, receiving the experience and transmitting it to the Dark Prince, sustained in their receiving by Slaanesh's power, but hollowed of anything that was originally theirs. This architectural arrangement tells us exactly what Slaanesh wants from the Great Game, not conquest in the military sense. Not even the corruption of followers in the way Khorne or Nurgle seek followers. Slaanesh wants absorption, the gradual, pleasurable, ultimately complete dissolution of all individual experience into the Dark Prince's own consciousness. A universe that still contains sensation and pleasure and beauty, but in which all of these things ultimately resolve into one vast, consuming experience that belongs entirely to Slaanesh, where the mortal beings of the galaxy are not servants or champions or food in any crude sense, but more like strings on an instrument present only to generate the music that the player of the instrument can hear and enjoy. The horror of this is subtle, in a way the other gods' horrors are not. Khorne's horror is the horror of violence. Nurgle's horror is the horror of disease and dissolution. Tzeentch's horror is the horror of losing control over your own fate and destiny. But Slaanesh's horror is the horror of enjoyment, of experiencing something so perfect that you lose yourself in it, and then discovering that the loss is permanent, and you would not choose to undo it even if you could. Section 14. The Daemon Princes, the Great Champions, and the Gods' Hands in Real Space. The Great Game would be an entirely internal affair of the Warp, relevant only to the Immaterium and its denizens, if not for the fact that its principles have ways of projecting power into the material universe. The Chaos Gods themselves cannot simply walk into real space. They are creatures of the Warp, too vast and too fundamentally immaterial to maintain stable presence in a dimension that runs on physics rather than emotion. But they have developed, over millennia, a class of agents who can cross the threshold in either direction, beings who are neither fully mortal nor fully divine, who walk the material universe in service of the Great Game while retaining the intelligence and independent will to pursue their patron's agenda with genuine effectiveness. These are the Daemon Princes, and understanding them is understanding the Great Game's reach into the material universe. A Daemon Prince begins as a mortal. This is important. They are not created by the gods from nothing, conjured like the demons that the gods can spin from fragments of their own consciousness. They start as human, or Aeldari, or occasionally something else, a being of flesh and blood, an ordinary mortal consciousness who, through extraordinary service, through the accumulation of so much divine favor that their patron decides to invest in them permanently, receives the gift of apotheosis. The transformation reshapes them utterly. Their body changes, bent and remade by the power flowing into it. Their consciousness expands, given access to fragments of divine awareness that no purely mortal mind could sustain. Their mortality ends. The biological processes that would eventually kill them are replaced by something that does not decay in the conventional sense, sustained instead by the psychic energy of their patron, but they remain themselves. This is the crucial distinction between a daemon prince and a daemon proper. A demon is a fragment of the god's consciousness given temporary form. It has personality and will, but those are essentially extensions of the god's personality and will. A daemon prince has their own identity, their own history, their own personal relationship with their patron that involves genuine individuality. They serve because they chose to serve, because the path of service led them here, because the god they dedicated themselves to delivered on the promises of power, of immortality, of significance that drew them to that service in the first place. Angron, the daemon primarch of the World Eaters, is perhaps the most vivid example of what daemon princehood looks like from the outside. His transformation during the Horus Heresy took something already terrifying, a primarch of extraordinary martial power, driven by rage and grief and the neurological damage of the butcher's nails, and compressed it into something that is essentially pure, cornate fury, given a form capable of sustained existence. He no longer thinks precisely in the way that mortals think. He reacts, he charges, he destroys. He is what Khorne's philosophy looks like when taken to its ultimate, irresistible extreme, a force of martial violence so pure and so committed that it cannot be reasoned with or deflected, only endured or not endured. But even Angron, in his rare moments of something approaching reflection, retains the ghost of who he was. His rage has a history behind it. The butcher's nails, the implants that were put in his brain before his primarchs were even found by the Emperor, that drove him to violence for decades before the heresy, these are still part of him in some form. The daemon prince is made of the mortal who became him, shaped but not erased by the power that transformed him. Magnus the Red, the daemon primarch of the Thousand Suns, represents the other end of the spectrum. Where Angron is pure, barely controlled fury, Magnus is extraordinary intelligence, given the burden of extraordinary psychic power and the guilt of extraordinary failure. He was one of the Emperor's most gifted sons, genuinely devoted to the pursuit of knowledge, and his path to daemonhood ran through a series of choices that each seemed reasonable in isolation, and which together constituted a catastrophe. His attempt to warn the Emperor of Horus's treachery by psychically breaking into Terra's defenses, a genuine act of loyalty, whatever the consequences, destroyed the Thousand Suns' homeworld of Prospero, got his legion's gene seed corrupted by Tzeentch's hand, and led directly to the rubric that reduced most of his marines to dust, animated by sorcery. Magnus has been a daemon prince for 10,000 years. He serves Tzeentch, but his service has a complicated emotional texture to it. There is devotion, but also something that functions like resentment, like the awareness that he has been used in ways he did not consent to, and that serve the Changer's purposes more than his own. In the lore, Magnus sometimes acts in ways that seem to express a genuine desire to understand his situation, to find some meaning in what happened to him, to not simply be a piece on Tzeentch's board, but to be something more like a player. Whether Tzeentch permits this understanding or merely simulates permitting it while actually continuing to use Magnus as a piece is, appropriately, entirely unclear. The mortal champions below the rank of Daemon Prince, the Chaos Space Marines, the Warlords, the corrupted human commanders are numerous beyond easy counting and individually less significant to the great game's mechanics. But collectively, they represent the game's primary method of influence in the material universe. Hundreds of thousands of Chaos Space Marines across the Traitor Legions, each one an agent of their patron god's agenda, each one a potential point of conversion or corruption for the mortals they encounter. The sheer volume of this presence in the material universe means that the great game's influence on human civilization is not merely the result of dramatic daemonic incursions or the campaigns of great daemon princes. It seeps in everywhere, through the cultists and the corrupted administrators, and the soldiers who have spent too long in environments saturated with warp energy, and who have begun to feel the whisper of something that is not entirely their own thoughts. The Eye of Terror, the largest permanent warp rift in the galaxy, born from the catastrophic birth of Slaanesh at the fall of the Aldari, is the primary home of these traitor legions. Within its boundaries, time flows differently. The warp and the material universe interpenetrate, and the daemon worlds that exist there are simultaneously in real space and in the warp. The legions have existed there for 10,000 years, fighting each other almost as much as they fight the Imperium. The Great Game's proxy wars filling the eye with a continuous roar of conflict that never quite resolves. Champions rise and fall. Daemon princes clash, and one of them falls into the warp to be reconstituted over centuries. New alliances form for specific campaigns and shatter within the decade. The Eye of Terror is the Great Game in miniature, rendered in blood and fire, and the ruins of what were once the proudest warriors the Emperor ever made. Section 15. The emotions that feed them, and the mortals who do not know they are feeding. Perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Great Game, and the thing that makes it feel genuinely personal, rather than merely cosmologically distant, is that you do not need to be a chaos cultist to participate in it. You do not need to know the chaos gods exist. You do not need to have ever heard of the warp, or the immaterium, or the Great Game, or any of the lore we have been discussing. Simply by existing. Simply by feeling things. Simply by being the kind of creature that has emotions, you are contributing to it. Every rage-filled moment, every flash of anger at something unjust, every burst of fury at something that hurt you, sends a ripple toward Khorne. Every grief, every despair, every moment of feeling that the situation is hopeless and will never improve, feeds Nurgle. Every burning ambition, every hunger for knowledge you do not yet have, every excited spark of hope that things could be different, goes toward Tzeentch. Every pleasure, every sensation of beauty or joy or physical delight, every moment of desire for more experience, contributes something to Slaanesh. This is not a comforting thought, but it is an honest one, and it is one that the lore takes seriously. The Warhammer 40K universe does not allow its mortals the comfort of ignorance as a form of protection. You are participating in the Great Game, whether you know it or not. The emotions you feel in private, the feelings you share with no one, the internal weather of your conscious life, all of it is legible to the warp in ways that the material universe's physics simply do not have an equivalent for. There is no psychic privacy. There is no emotional neutrality. Every feeling matters to someone who is paying attention, and the Chaos Gods are always paying attention. This is why the Imperium's approach to population control is so extreme, so oppressive, so seemingly disproportionate in its restriction of individual expression and experience. The Inquisition's persecution of psychers, the constant surveillance of populations for signs of corruption, the brutal suppression of any expression of chaos-adjacent emotion, rage, excessive pleasure, grief taken past the point of function, ambition that might lead to reaching beyond one's station. All of this is, from a certain perspective, a form of emotional triage. An attempt, however brutal and misguided, and counterproductive in many specific instances, to manage the galaxy's emotional output so that it does not feed the Chaos Gods faster than the Imperium can deal with the consequences. It does not work. It cannot work, because the emotions the Imperium is trying to suppress are not removable from human experience without removing the capacity for experience itself. You cannot make people stop being afraid of death without making them stop valuing life. You cannot make people stop feeling rage without making them stop caring about justice. You cannot eliminate ambition without eliminating the drive to improve, to build, to achieve. The Imperium's suppression creates exactly the wrong conditions. The constant fear and rage and hopelessness of living under an oppressive theocratic empire generates enormous quantities of warp-feeding emotion. The very effort to starve the Chaos Gods is one of their primary food sources. Tzeentch finds this exquisite. Nurgle finds it deeply satisfying. Khorne does not notice the irony, but benefits from it regardless. Slaanesh whispers to those whose suppressed desires have built such pressure that release, when it comes, will be spectacular. The ordinary lives of ordinary people in the Warhammer 40K universe are, in this sense, the actual substance of the Great Game. Not the dramatic battles of Space Marines, not the campaigns of Daemon Princes, not the machinations of Chaos Lords in the Eye of Terror. These are the spectacle. The substance is the billions of anonymous mortals going about their lives, feeling things, dying, having their souls absorbed into the warp where the gods wait for them. The war is impressive. The quiet despair of a guardsman who knows they are going to die for nothing is what actually matters to the powers that sustain the conflict. This is one of the reasons the Warhammer 40K universe is so enduringly bleak. It is not bleak because the battles always go badly or because the heroes always die. It is bleak because the conditions for bleakness are baked into the structure of what it means to be alive in this universe. The things you feel are fuel for things that want to destroy you. The emotions that make life worth living are the same emotions that make the universe more hostile to life. You cannot win that paradox. You can only live with it. Section 16. The Great Rift and the New Configuration of the Great Game. The opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, represents the most significant structural change to the Great Game's relationship with the material universe in 10,000 years. It deserves detailed examination because it changes not just the strategic situation, but the fundamental nature of the interaction between the warp and real space. Prior to the Rift, the primary points of contact between the Great Game's arena and the material universe were the established warp rifts, the Eye of Terror, the Maelstrom, the Screaming Vortex, and others. These rifts were significant and dangerous, but they were bounded. They had edges. They could be navigated around, their access points monitored, the demonic forces that emerged from them confronted at the points of egress rather than everywhere simultaneously. The Great Rift changed this in the most dramatic way possible. A warp rift stretching across the entire galaxy, cutting it in half from one side to the other, is not a localized threat to be managed. It is a structural change to the reality of the galaxy itself. The barrier between the warp and the material universe has not merely been weakened in one place. It has been fundamentally compromised along an axis that touches every part of the galaxy. Demonic incursions can now occur with dramatically less difficulty, in far more regions than before. The shadow in the warp, the psychic interference generated by proximity to the immaterium, is stronger across huge swaths of previously stable space. Warp travel is more dangerous. Astropathic communication is less reliable. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon generated by the Emperor's suffering on the Golden Throne, reaches less far than it once did. For the Great Game, this is a windfall. Each of the four gods gained significantly from the rift's opening, and each began to exploit their gains immediately. The lore describes the aftermath of the rift in terms of all four gods simultaneously reaching into the newfound access points and beginning to work. Khorne's blood crusades became more frequent and more intense. Nurgle's scourge stars, daemon worlds, blooming from the corruption, spreading outward from the rift, appeared in multiple sectors. Tzeentch's schemes proliferated through the confusion, finding new leverage in the disrupted communications and broken command structures that the rift's opening had caused. Slaanesch's agents spread through the populations left vulnerable by the rift's effects. The fear and despair and desperate sensation-seeking of people who suddenly found themselves isolated in the dark, with something howling on the other side of reality's walls. But, and this is critical, they did so in competition with each other. The advantage the rift gave them was not a shared advantage that they could consolidate together. It was an opportunity that each of the four immediately began to race to exploit before the others could, because any advance one of them made was an advance that the others had not made. And in the zero-sum arithmetic of the Great Game, a relative advantage is the same as an absolute one. The immediate post-Rift period saw some of the most intense conflicts of the Great Game spilling into real space that has ever been recorded. Demonic forces from different patrons clashed in corridors of space where the thinned barrier between the warp and reality was generating feedback that amplified their conflicts. Battles that in the material universe looked like chaos forces fighting each other, which confused Imperial commanders enormously, since they were accustomed to thinking of all chaos as pointing in the same direction, were in fact the physical expression of the Great Game's immediate response to the new conditions the Rift had created. The Indomitus Crusade that Guillemot launched in response to the Rift found itself navigating this complicated situation. The Imperium's traditional approach to chaos, identify the incursion, concentrate force, push it back was not well calibrated to a situation where multiple incursions were occurring simultaneously, where some of those incursions were fighting each other rather than the Imperium, and where the most tactically intelligent approach in some situations was to let two Chaos factions that were already engaged with each other continue their engagement, rather than provoking both into directing their attention toward the Imperium. This is not a dynamic that any imperial strategic doctrine had been written to handle. The Codex Astartes does not contain a chapter on how to exploit the Great Game's internal conflicts. The Tactica Imperialis does not discuss the strategic value of letting demon forces exhaust themselves against each other. These are things that have had to be improvised, developed in the field by commanders who were sharp enough to recognize what they were seeing and flexible enough to deviate from doctrine when the situation demanded it. Guilliman himself is, by the lore's account, someone who grasps the nature of the threat at a level that most Imperial commanders do not. His return from stasis after 10,000 years gave him a perspective that the Imperium he returned to desperately lacked the ability to see it from the outside, to recognize how much of what it does to survive is also contributing to the conditions that threaten it. He has not been able to fix this. The Imperium is too vast, too calcified, too deeply committed to its own dysfunction to be reformed at any speed that would matter before the threats overwhelm it. But he understands it, and in the aftermath of the rift, that understanding has shaped the Indomitus Crusade in ways that have made it marginally more effective than it would otherwise have been. The galaxy, as it stands in the 41st millennium's closing years, is a place where the Great Game has achieved a level of direct, real space expression that has not been seen since perhaps the earliest days after Slaaneish's birth. The rift has changed the rules. The distance between the Great Game's arena and the material universe is shorter than it has ever been. The four gods are closer to the material universe than they have been in 10,000 years. And they are still fighting each other, still competing, still pursuing the game's logic, even as they consume the galaxy's stability. The question that the lore leaves open, as it leaves most of its deepest questions open, is whether this represents a permanent escalation, a new baseline for the interaction between chaos and the material universe, or whether it is a phase that will eventually stabilize into something new, whether the thinned barrier will hold at its current level or continue to weaken, whether the Great Rift is a wound that will eventually heal or a wound that will keep tearing. Given the nature of the Chaos Gods and the logic of the Great Game, the answer is probably that neither outcome is stable. The game will produce new conditions that no one can fully anticipate. The warp will continue to churn. The boundary between it and the material universe will continue to flex and shift. And somewhere in all of that shifting, the next major turn in the history of the galaxy is already being set in motion by the plans of demon princes, by the schemes of Tsientian agents, by the march of Cornate blood crusades, by the slow spread of Nurglite corruption, by the whispers of Slaaneshi temptation in the ears of those who are almost, but not quite strong enough to resist them. The Great Game continues, as it always has, as it always will. Section 17. What all of this means, and why it matters. Let us sit back from the detail for a moment and think about what makes all of this work as a creative and philosophical construction. The Great Game is, at bottom, a story about power and its limitations. Not the limitations of power in the sense of even the strongest warriors can be defeated by sufficient force. The limitation it describes is more fundamental than that it is the limitation built into the very nature of what these entities are. The Chaos Gods are the most powerful beings in the Warhammer 40K universe. They are older than the Imperium by orders of magnitude. They are made of forces that cannot be eliminated. They have access to resources of psychic energy that no mortal civilization could match. They should, by any ordinary logic, have won everything long ago, and they have not. And the reason they have not is not that the heroes of the Imperium are clever enough or strong enough to stop them. The reason is that their own nature prevents it. They are simultaneously the most powerful forces in the galaxy and the most constrained beings in the galaxy, locked in a pattern of mutual competition that prevents any one of them from ever achieving the decisive advantage that would allow them to simply end the opposition and claim everything. This is philosophically interesting because it suggests something about the relationship between power and purpose. The Chaos Gods have essentially infinite power within the warp, and their power in the material universe, while constrained by the physics of real space, is still vastly beyond anything mortal. But they have no purpose that transcends their own nature. Khorne cannot want anything other than what Khorne is. Nurgle cannot desire anything that is not an expression of decay and acceptance. Tzeentch cannot scheme toward any endpoint other than the continuation of scheming. Slaanesh cannot hunger for anything other than sensation. And because their purposes are fixed, because they are locked into being what they are, they cannot coordinate. They cannot step outside their own nature long enough to pursue a genuinely shared goal. This is in contrast to the mortals who fight against them, and this contrast is at the heart of why the setting works as well as it does. Mortals can choose to be something other than what they naturally are. A human who is afraid can choose to act as if they are not afraid. A soldier who wants to run can choose to stand and hold. A person who feels rage can choose not to act on it. This capacity for choice, for genuinely deciding to be something other than what your nature immediately dictates, is precisely the thing the Chaos Gods do not have. They are their nature, completely and without remainder, and their nature is ultimately self-defeating. The small, quiet heroism of the Warhammer 40K universe, the kind that happens not in the dramatic last stands of legendary space marines, but in the countless unremarked decisions of ordinary mortals to keep going, to not give in, to continue being human in the face of everything that works against human survival, is heroism that the Chaos Gods literally cannot understand or replicate. They cannot choose to be something other than what they are, but the people they are trying to consume can. And in that asymmetry lies the one genuine weakness of the otherwise unassailable ruinous powers. You cannot defeat gods made of emotion by removing the emotion, but you might, just might, be able to outlast them by being more than your emotions, by being the thing that feels the rage and the grief and the desire and the ambition and chooses consciously, deliberately, at cost, what to do with those feelings rather than simply enacting them, by being, in the end, something the Chaos Gods cannot quite digest because you are more than the single-note emotional output they were designed to feed on. Whether that is enough is a question the Warhammer 40K universe answers with a very long, very dark, very uncertain pause. Not yes, not no, just, we are still here. We have not been consumed yet. The great game continues, and we are still standing in it. In the grim darkness of the far future, that is perhaps the most honest answer available, and the most human one. If you made it all the way to the end of this, thank you from the bottom of my heart, genuinely. These deep dives take a long time to put together, and knowing that someone sat with this for the whole journey means everything. If you are watching this and you have not subscribed, please do so now. It is the single best way to make sure this content keeps getting made. Leave a like if you found it worthwhile, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing where this reaches, and I read every comment. If there is another piece of 40K lore you want explored at this depth, a specific faction, a particular event, a character whose history you want unpacked, tell me in the comments. The next video is already in progress. Until then, keep your faith strong and your bolter ready. In the grim darkness of the far future, they are both going to be very much needed. Additional section. The emotional logic of each god's followers. Something that rarely gets the attention it deserves when discussing the Chaos Gods is the internal logic of why anyone would follow them. Not the external pressure, the corruption that warps a soldier's judgment, the despair that erodes resistance, the promises that turn out to be lies, but the genuine inner logic of each path, the place inside a person where the decision to walk toward each of the 4 Chaos Gods makes sense. Because if you want to understand what each god is fighting for in the great game, you need to understand what each one offers that is actually valuable, actually desirable, in a way that isn't simply the product of manipulation or madness. Khorne's path is, in some ways, the most honest of the 4. There is no deception in Khorne's offer. He does not promise you comfort, or longevity, or hidden knowledge, or pleasures you have not yet imagined. He promises you the war. He promises you that if you commit yourself to combat with total devotion, with no reserve held back for self-preservation or strategic retreat or the calculation of future advantage. If you simply throw yourself entirely into the business of fighting and let the chips fall where they may, he will notice, and he will reward you, and the skulls you add to his throne will matter. There is something almost admirable in this, in a dark way. Of all the chaos gods, Khorne is the one who most consistently delivers what he promises. His champions die violently, yes, but they die fighting. They die as they lived. And from a certain perspective, particularly the perspective of someone whose life has convinced them that fighting is the only honest mode of existence, the only transaction with the universe that is direct enough to trust this, is genuinely appealing. The Space Marines of the World Eaters who fell to Khorne did not do so because they were tricked. They did so because the butcher's nails that had been implanted in their brains were already driving them toward violence, and Khorne was the only power in the universe that could offer them a context in which that violence was not a curse, but a gift. In their specific, terrible situation, Khorne's offer made sense. It does not make it right. But understanding why it made sense to them is essential to understanding what Khorne is and what he is fighting for. Nurgle's path is the most complex emotionally, because it involves a genuine transformation of perspective that is hard to imagine from outside it. The path to Nurgle begins with suffering, usually specific, personal, intimate suffering. The suffering of watching something you love decay, the suffering of knowing that your own body is failing, the suffering of grief so complete that the only honest thing you can do is sit inside it and let it swallow you. Nurgle meets people at that point of maximum suffering and makes a genuinely astonishing offer, that the suffering is not something to be escaped or overcome, but something to be accepted and transformed. That decay is not the end, but the beginning of the next thing. That death is not destruction, but transition. And that if you can accept this, truly accept it, at the cellular level of your being, the suffering stops. This is not a lie. The suffering does stop. The transformation that accepting Nurgle's embrace produces in a person is real and complete. They stop hurting. They stop being afraid of what is coming. They find themselves surrounded by the warm, disgusting, impossibly affectionate community of Nurgle's other followers, and they feel, genuinely feel, that they belong here in a way they have never belonged anywhere else. The horror of this is not that it is a deception, but that it is not that the peace it offers is real, and that people who were in genuine agony find genuine relief in it at the cost of things that were also genuinely part of who they were. Tzeentch's path attracts a particular kind of person, someone for whom the world, as it exists, is simply not enough, not in the sensory excess sense of Slaanesh, and not in the martial frustration sense of Khorne, but in a specifically intellectual or political or ambitious sense. Someone who looks at the arrangement of power in the universe and sees opportunities being missed, potentials being squandered, possibilities being closed off by the conservatism and fear of those who benefit from the existing order. Someone who wants the future to be different and believes they are capable of making it different, if only they had enough information, enough leverage, enough power. Tzeentch offers all of these things, forbidden knowledge that illuminates hidden connections. Psychic power that allows direct manipulation of events rather than the slow, grinding work of conventional politics or military power. Visions of possible futures that seem to provide the edge needed to finally make things go differently. These are seductive offers to a particular kind of mind, and the tragedy of those who accept them is that the knowledge is real, the power is real, the visions are real, but they are all in service of Tzeentch's purposes rather than the followers, and the follower almost never figures this out until it is too late to matter. The Thousand Sons are the archetype of this path. Brilliant scholars, dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge beyond the restrictions the Imperium placed on its citizens, willing to explore dimensions of reality that official doctrine declared off-limits. Their curiosity was genuine. Their dedication to truth was genuine. And they followed that curiosity and that dedication, step by reasonable step, to Tzeentch, and then to the rubric, and to dust. Slaanesh's path is the most accessible in one sense, and the most immediately comprehensible, because the initial stage of it is something nearly every sentient being has experienced. The moment when an experience is so good that you immediately want more of it. When a pleasure is so complete that it makes everything that came before it seem faint and inadequate. When a sensation is so overwhelming that it temporarily reorganizes your understanding of what existence can be and what it felt like before, this moment seems unbearably gray by comparison. The difference between a person who has that experience and moves on from it, incorporating it into a rich life of many different kinds of experience, and a person who begins the long descent into Slaanesh's service, is the difference between that person and someone whose need to repeat the experience becomes the organizing principle of their life. Slaanesh's followers are addicts, but addicts of a particular and devastating kind, addicted not to a specific substance, but to intensity itself, to the experience of being fully consumed by something, which means the threshold keeps rising, and the thing required to meet it keeps becoming more extreme. What each of these paths reveals about the Great Game is that the gods are not simply competing for the souls of the morally weak or the psychologically fragile. They are competing for anyone who feels anything strongly enough. The most dedicated, the most passionate, the most honest about their own desires are in some ways the most vulnerable, because what each god offers is a direct and powerful amplification of the thing those people already most want. Not a corruption of their nature, but an intensification of it, taken to extremes that eventually consume the person, but that, at each step, feel like the next logical development of something that was already present. This is the true genius and the true horror of the Chaos Gods as a creative construction. They do not recruit by making people into something they are not. They recruit by making people into the most extreme version of something they already are. And in a universe full of intense, passionate, committed, driven beings, soldiers and scholars and survivors and adventurers, that is a very wide recruitment pool indeed. Additional section: the cycle of dominant powers and how it shapes history. The Great Game has a rhythm to it that, looked at across sufficiently long timescales, reveals something like historical cycles in the material universe. Because the emotional output of mortal civilization is not constant, it rises and falls with the conditions that produce it. The relative dominance of the four chaos gods shifts over time in ways that correspond, roughly, to what is happening in the material universe. The lore identifies several distinct periods in the Great Game's history, where the balance of power shifted significantly. The birth of Slaanesh in M30, the fall of the Eldari, produced an immediate and dramatic reshuffling. Slaanesh, arriving in the warp already engorged with the souls of an entire psychically potent civilization, immediately began expanding at the expense of the other three. Khorne, affronted at being pushed back, flew into a rage that itself generated tremendous power and allowed him to reclaim his territory and more. Tzeentch and Nurgle, observing Slaanesh's rapid expansion, briefly aligned against the newcomer, which created a 3-against-1 dynamic for the early post-fall period. The stabilization of this configuration, the four great powers settling into the approximate power relationship that has characterized them for most of the Imperium's history, took centuries. During the Imperium's age of apostasy, in the period between M34 and M36, Nurgle and Tzeentch became the dominant powers in the Great Game, fed by the religious turmoil and the political chaos of an Imperium tearing itself apart through internal conflict. The Age of Apostasy was a period of extraordinary instability in imperial governance, with competing religious factions, corrupt ecclesiarchs, and genuine theological warfare producing exactly the kind of despair and ambitious scheming that both Nurgle and Tzeentch feed on most effectively. The consequences of this period of dual dominance can still be traced in the political and religious structures of the Imperium in the 41st millennium. The Long War, the 10,000-year period of conflict between the traitor legions in the Eye of Terror and the Imperium, has been Khorne's primary feeding ground, an almost uninterrupted stream of violence that has sustained the Blood God's dominance for a sustained period unprecedented in the Great Game's history. No other god has managed to generate the kind of long-term, galaxy-spanning, essentially permanent war that Khorne has enjoyed since the Horus Heresy. This explains why the lore consistently identifies Khorne as the currently dominant power in the 41st millennium, not because he is inherently the strongest, but because the conditions that feed him have been maintained for longer and more consistently than the conditions feeding any of the others. The Great Rift has disrupted this pattern. By dramatically increasing the access all four gods have to the material universe, it has created a period of elevated power for all of them simultaneously, which in practice means elevated conflict between all of them simultaneously. The dominant power relationship that characterized the 41st millennium, Khorne on top, the others working to reduce his advantage, may be giving way to a more chaotic configuration, where the relative positions shift more rapidly, and the conflicts between the four are more immediate and intense. Historically speaking, periods of rapid power shift in the Great Game have corresponded to periods of unusual instability in the material universe. When the gods are in rough equilibrium, the material universe gets a kind of dark stability. The conflicts are constant, but relatively predictable, and the forces of order can at least plan around them. When the balance is disrupted, when one god is rising fast or multiple gods are expanding simultaneously, the material universe becomes dramatically more dangerous, incursions are more frequent, corruption spreads faster, the plans and institutions of mortal civilization are undermined more rapidly and more completely. The galaxy of the late 41st millennium is, by almost every measure, in one of these periods of disrupted equilibrium. The Great Rift has changed the conditions. The gods are adjusting. The balance, whatever form it takes in the new configuration, has not yet been reached. And in the period of adjustment, the material universe pays the cost of the Great Game's recalibration. Additional section, the unchangeable paradox and the lesson it teaches. We come back, at the very end, to where we began. The paradox at the center of the Great Game. No one can win. The winning condition is identical to the losing condition. The prize, if claimed, destroys the claimant. And yet the game continues, has always continued, will always continue, because stopping is not an option available to the players. The Chaos Gods are, in this sense, the most tragic figures in the Warhammer 40K universe. More tragic than the Emperor, who at least had a plan that might have worked if it had not been sabotaged. More tragic than the Primarchs, who had identities and histories and relationships and lost them to war and corruption and the impossible demands of serving a father who needed them to be more than persons. More tragic even than the untold billions of ordinary mortals who live and die in ignorance of the larger forces that shape their lives. The Chaos Gods are tragic because they cannot choose to be anything other than what they are. They cannot want anything they do not want. They cannot rest. They cannot find peace. Nurgle might seem to be the exception, the god of acceptance and contentment, but even Nurgle's contentment is its own kind of trap. He cannot be content in a way that does not involve the spread of his particular brand of contented decay. He cannot accept the universe as it is without simultaneously trying to make it more like his garden. His peace is aggressive. His contentment is an infection. Even the warmest of the four Chaos Gods cannot simply stop. There is something in this that speaks to a genuine philosophical insight about the nature of power and the danger of becoming too defined by a single principle. The Chaos Gods are what they are to an absolute degree. Khorne is rage without remainder. Nurgle is decay without remainder. Tsainch is change without remainder. Slaanesh is sensation without remainder. And this absolute quality, this completeness of identity, is simultaneously the source of their power and the mechanism of their imprisonment. You cannot be absolutely anything without being absolutely constrained by being that thing and nothing else. In contrast, the mortal beings they feed on are for all their weakness, for all their mortality, for all the ways in which they are outmatched by beings of this scale multiple, complex, capable of being rage and grief and ambition and pleasure and peace, all in different moments, all in the same lifetime, capable of choosing, sometimes, which of these to express, capable of being, in some moments, more than any single emotional note. And this multiplicity, this inability to be reduced to a single pure principle, is the one thing the Chaos Gods cannot replicate and cannot consume without remainder. A person in the grip of pure rage is Khorne's servant, whether they know it or not. But a person who feels rage and chooses not to enact it, who holds it, acknowledges it, understands it, and then sets it aside in favor of something more considered, has done something that Khorne literally cannot do. They have transcended their immediate emotional state. And in that transcendence, however small and however temporary, lies the only real resistance available to beings facing gods made of feeling. The Great Game will not end. The Chaos Gods will not be defeated. The war will continue. but the capacity of conscious beings to be more than any single feeling, to contain contradictions, to choose however imperfectly, however inconsistently, something other than what their immediate nature demands, is a capacity that the great game cannot neutralize. It can be corrupted, overwhelmed, eroded, but it keeps regenerating, because it is the same source as the very feelings that feed the gods. It comes from consciousness itself, which is the one thing the galaxy keeps producing no matter what happens to it. In the end, the great game teaches this: power without multiplicity is power without freedom. The Chaos Gods are the most powerful beings in the galaxy, and among the least free, and the mortals who resist them are the weakest beings in relation to them, and among the most free. The battle between them is not, in the final analysis, a battle between strength and weakness. It is a battle between absolute identity and contingent possibility, between gods who can only be what they are, and persons who can, sometimes, choose to be something more. Who wins that battle depends on what you believe about the universe. The Warhammer 40K setting declines to give you an answer. It presents you with the situation, holds it open, and dares you to find something in it beyond despair. Most days, looking at it clearly, it is very hard to find. But the days when you can, when you see something in the stubbornness of ordinary people holding on in impossible circumstances, something in the small acts of decency and courage that appear even in the darkest fiction those days, it is worth noting that the Chaos Gods cannot take that from you. They can feed on your fear and your rage and your desire. But the moment when you choose, however briefly, something better, that moment belongs to you. In the grim darkness of the far future, that might be the only thing that does. A final thought on the nature of the great game. There is one more thing worth saying, something that the deep lore only hints at, but which sits underneath everything we have discussed. The Chaos Gods do not know they are trapped. Or rather, and this is philosophically stranger, they may know it, in the way that they know anything, which is to say, imperfectly, filtered through the specific nature that defines them, and that they cannot see past. Khorne knows that the blood must always flow, and he experiences this as desire, not as compulsion. Nurgle knows that everything must eventually decay, and he experiences this as wisdom, not as limitation. Tzeentch knows that nothing can ever be allowed to stabilize, and he experiences this as the correct way of seeing the universe, not as the prison it actually is. Slaanesh knows that sensation must always be pursued beyond any previous limit, and experiences this as the highest virtue, not as addiction. None of them have a view from outside their own nature that would allow them to recognize that nature as a constraint. They are too much what they are to be able to see what they are from the outside, and this may be the deepest difference between them and the mortal beings they feed on. Mortals can, sometimes, see themselves from outside, can wonder whether the person they have been is the person they want to be, can ask whether the feelings driving them are serving them, or whether they are serving the feelings. This capacity for self-reflection, imperfect, inconsistent, often ignored, always costly, is the one faculty the Chaos Gods do not possess. And it may, in the final accounting, be the only weapon that matters in a war that cannot otherwise be won. The great game goes on. You are already in it. The only question that remains is what you choose to do with that knowledge. Stay curious, stay human, and as always, thank you for watching.